Chapter 1, The Weight of Horizons. The sea did not welcome them, it merely tolerated their arrival. As the iron gates of the Brittany estate groaned open, the Atlantic breeze swept across the high cliffs of the peninsula, carrying with it the sharp, biting scent of brine and damp earth. It was the first day of an endless summer vacation, yet the atmosphere held none of the golden warmth of a holiday. Instead, a pale, low-hanging mist clung to the rugged landscape, swallowing the jagged edges of the stone cliffs and blurring the boundary between the slate-gray ocean and the sky. Elena kept her forehead pressed against the cool glass of the passenger window, her breath creating tiny patches of condensation that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Her gaze traveled over the endless expanses of wild lavender and tall, wind-whipped sea grass that bordered the narrow gravel driveway. The flowers were in bloom, a muted purple carpet stretching toward the abyss, but under the heavy sky, the color felt less like a celebration of summer and more like a bruise upon the earth. Beside her, Julian's hands were steady on the steering wheel, his knuckles slightly white against the dark leather. His eyes were fixed entirely on the road ahead, his posture rigid, defined by the meticulous, unyielding order he carried into every corner of his life. He drove with a quiet, deliberate focus, as if the act of navigating the winding coastal path required his entire soul. He did not look at her. He had not looked at her for the last 2 hours of the journey. Between them sat a chasm of silence so profound it felt like a third passenger in the car. It was not a hostile silence, but rather one born of exhaustion, the quiet that follows a storm that has long since run out of rain but left the ground utterly saturated. They were a couple bound together by years of shared history, yet as the tires crunched to a halt on the gravel courtyard of the grand, weathered stone house, the distance between them felt as vast as the ocean roaring just beyond the garden walls. The estate itself was a masterpiece of old-world isolation. Built from dark, salt-stained granite, its tall, narrow windows stared out at the Atlantic like hollow eyes. It was a place designed to withstand elements, a sanctuary meant to weather the fiercest of gales. For Julian, a man who found comfort in the structural permanence of stone and the logical precision of architecture, the house was a refuge. He stepped out of the vehicle, his coat instantly catching the wind, and stood for a moment staring up at the facade. To him, the cracked mortar and the weathered slate tiles were puzzles to be analyzed, problems that could be solved with time, tools, and effort. Here, away from the demanding noise of the city, he could immerse himself in the tangible, predictable laws of physics and restoration. He could rebuild what was broken, so long as it was made of stone. Elena stepped out into the damp air, the wind immediately unraveling a strand of her dark hair and whipping it across her face. She closed the car door with a dull thud that was instantly swallowed by the rhythmic, booming thunders of the tide crashing against the cliffs below. She did not look at the house. Instead, her eyes sought the horizon, searching for a break in the clouds that she knew would not come. As an artist who worked with textiles, Elena understood the world through touch, texture, and the fluid, unpredictable nature of threads. Where Julian saw structures, she saw the fraying edges of things. To her, the estate did not feel like a sanctuary, it felt like a beautiful cage, a place where the silence would only magnify the unraveling of their marriage. They had come to this isolated coast to find each other again, to mend the invisible tears in their foundation, but standing in the shadow of the monolithic house, the task felt monumental. Julian began unloading their luggage from the trunk, his movements methodical and efficient. He lifted the heavy leather bags with practiced ease, his focus entirely consumed by the physical logistics of their arrival. Elena reached down to assist with a smaller box containing her spools of silk and linen threads, but his hand gently closed over the cardboard edge first. For a fleeting second, their fingers brushed, a sudden, electric spark of warmth in the chilly coastal air. Elena's breath hitched in her throat. She looked up, her eyes searching his face, desperate for a glimpse of the man who used to look at her with a warmth that could melt the coldest winter. She looked for a softening in his jaw, a slight crease around his eyes, a silent admission that he, too, felt the agonizing weight of the space between them. Julian's gaze lingered on hers for a single heartbeat. His dark eyes, usually so sharp and analytical, clouded with a sudden, unreadable shadow, a flicker of deep, fracturing grief that he instantly locked away. He pulled his hand back, lifting the box himself, and turned toward the massive timber doors of the estate. The moment vanished as quickly as a drop of rain falling into the sea, leaving Elena standing alone in the gravel, her hand tingling from the brief, aborted contact. Inside, the house smelled of cedar, old paper, and the omnipresent dampness of the ocean. The grand entrance hall was cavernous, with high vaulted ceilings and a sweeping stone staircase that curved upward into the shadows of the upper floors. Dust motes danced in the pale, filtered light that struggled through the high windows. Julian set the bags down at the foot of the stairs, his footsteps echoing sharply against the flagstone floor. Without a word, he turned toward the long corridor that led to the eastern wing, where a makeshift study awaited his blueprints and drafting tables. He walked with the purpose of a man fleeing a ghost, his shoulders squared, disappearing into the dim light of the hallway. Left alone in the center of the hall, Elena felt the sheer scale of the isolation press down upon her. She walked slowly toward the tall French doors at the back of the house, which opened onto a crumbling stone terrace overlooking the sea. She pushed the doors open, stepping out into the full force of the Atlantic wind. The view was breathtaking, terrifying, and profoundly melancholic. Below the terrace, the cliffs dropped vertically into a churning cauldron of white foam and dark water. The tide was coming in, the waves slamming against the ancient stone with a relentless, tragic passion, retreating only to strike again and again. Elena leaned against the cold stone balustrade, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. She closed her eyes, listening to the symphony of the sea, the deep rumble of the water, the whistle of the wind through the balusters, the cry of a solitary gull circling the gray sky. There were no words left to say. They had used all their words in the city, spoken in hushed, agonizing tones in the dead of night, and none of them had been enough to bridge the gap. Now, on this high cliff at the edge of the world, the silence was their only language. From the window of the eastern wing above, a curtain shifted. Julian stood in the shadows, looking down at the terrace. From this height, Elena looked small, fragile, yet utterly resilient against the backdrop of the vast, uncaring ocean. He watched the wind catch the hem of her dress, watched the way she held herself against the cold. A profound, aching longing filled his chest, a desperate urge to run down the stairs, throw his arms around her, and hold her until the cracks in both their souls fused back together. But he did not move. He remained in the dark, paralyzed by a secret weight he could not name, watching the woman he loved look out at a sea that offered no answers. The summer vacation had begun, but as the twilight began to bleed a deep, sorrowful blue into the foggy horizon, it felt as though they had merely arrived at the beginning of a long, beautiful wreck. Chapter 2, The Threads of Separation. The first week of the summer faded into the second, not with the bright transition of sunlit days, but through the slow, monotonous shifting of the coastal fog. Inside the grand granite walls of the estate, time lost its sharp edges, stretching into long, quiet hours where the only markers of the passing day were the changing shadows on the floor and the predictable retreat and advance of the Atlantic tide. Elena established her sanctuary in a sunroom on the western side of the house. It was a room surrounded by tall, arched glass panels, many of them warped and distorted by decades of salt spray, giving the outside world a blurred, watery appearance. Here, she set up her heavy wooden loom and arranged her materials. Skeins of raw linen, spools of delicate silk, and roughly spun wools filled the corners of the room, bringing a faint scent of earth and natural dyes to the musty air. Her hands worked with a frantic, restless energy. She sat before the loom for hours, her bare feet pressing the wooden treadles, her fingers weaving the shuttle back and forth through the warped threads. She was working on a large tapestry, an abstract expanse of deep indigo, slate gray, and ivory, the exact colors of the stormy horizon outside her window. Weaving was her way of thinking when thoughts became too heavy to bear. Every knot she tied, every tension she adjusted, was an unspoken question. She poured the entirety of her unexpressed longing into the fabric, her fingers pulling the threads tight, trying to create something solid and beautiful out of the fraying remnants of her life. Yet, no matter how tightly she packed the weft, the space between the threads remained, a quiet reminder of the spaces that existed everywhere around her. Across the courtyard, in the eastern wing of the house, Julian lived in an entirely different world, one governed by steel rulers, heavy drafting paper, and the uncompromising laws of geometry. He had cleared a massive oak table to serve as his workspace, covering it with historical blueprints of the estate and technical drawings of its foundation. Julian worked in near immobility, hunched over his papers under the pale glow of a brass desk lamp. He was tracking a microscopic fracture in the granite foundation of the house, a structural weakness that had allowed the dampness of the cliffside to seep into the lower cellars. With a fine-tipped ink pen, he drew line after line, calculating the load-bearing capacity of the ancient stone, measuring angles down to the millimeter. For Julian, this meticulous analysis was a fortress. If he kept his mind entirely occupied by structural mechanics, he did not have to face the terrifying, unmeasurable void in his own chest. Stones could be weighed, fractures could be mapped, mortar could be replaced. The decay of a house was a logical process with a logical cure. But the slow, silent decay of his marriage, and the phantom grief that haunted his every waking hour, possessed no blueprints. He could not calculate the force required to break a human heart, nor could he draft a plan to repair it. So, he buried himself deeper into the stone, using the scratching of his pen against the paper to drown out the rhythmic, agonizing thud of the waves against the cliffs. They existed as two planets orbiting the same cold star, their paths meticulously designed to avoid a direct collision. Meals became a silent ritual of avoidance. In the evenings, Elena would place a tray with bread, cheese, and dark summer fruits on the edge of the dining table, her movements quiet and deliberate. A few moments later, as if guided by an unspoken cue, Julian would emerge from the darkness of the corridor. They would sit across from one another at the long, dark wood table, the space between them illuminated by a single, dying candle. They did not look at each other's eyes, instead, they watched each other's hands. Elena observed the ink stains on Julian's fingertips and the rigid way he held his knife, noting the tension that never left his shoulders. Julian watched the silver rings on Elena's fingers catch the candlelight, observing the slight tremor in her hands when she poured the water. Every movement was loaded with a heavy, pregnant significance, a desperate desire to reach out that was instantly crushed by the fear of what might happen if they tried. They would eat in silence, the only sound the clinking of silver against porcelain and the wind rattling the heavy window panes, before retreating back to their respective corners of the night. One afternoon, the suffocating atmosphere inside the house became too much for Elena to endure. Leaving her loom, she stepped out onto the damp grass of the estate grounds, walking down a narrow, overgrown dirt path that led toward the southern cliffs. The summer heat was heavy and humid, trapped beneath a ceiling of low, yellow-tinged clouds. The smell of wild lavender was intoxicatingly thick, mixing with the sharp iron scent of the wet rocks below. As she walked, she felt the physical reality of the isolation closing in. The estate was completely cut off from the rest of the world, bordered on three sides by the sheer drop of the cliffs and on the fourth by a dense, dark forest of wind-bent oaks. There was no escape from the silence, no external noise to distract from the internal unraveling. She stopped at a vantage point where the path curved sharply near the edge of the precipice. The sea below was a churning mass of dark green water, swirling around jagged black rocks that rose from the foam like broken teeth. Elena stood at the edge, the wind pulling at her hair and the hem of her linen skirt, looking down into the abyss. She felt a profound sense of vertigo, not just from the height, but from the realization of how fragile their existence truly was. A single step could end everything, a single word could shatter the illusion they were desperately trying to maintain. Turning her gaze along the coastline, her eyes caught something she hadn't noticed before. At the furthest, most isolated edge of the estate grounds, wedged into a cleft of the rock where the cliff met the sea, sat a small, single-story stone cottage. Its roof was covered in dark moss, and its small windows were gray with salt crust. It appeared abandoned, a forgotten relic of a time when fishermen used the cove below. But as Elena watched, a thin, fragile trail of blue smoke began to curl from the stone chimney, rising slowly against the backdrop of the gray sky. Someone was living there. A sudden, sharp chill ran down her spine, entirely unrelated to the ocean breeze. The presence of another living soul on this desolate peninsula felt like a tear in the fabric of their isolation. It was a variable they hadn't accounted for, a quiet intrusion into the private purgatory she and Julian had constructed. She took a step closer to the edge of the path, her eyes straining to see any movement near the cottage. For a long time, there was nothing, only the smoke rising and the waves crashing. But the knowledge of that fire burning at the edge of the world stayed with her, a tiny, flickering spark of curiosity and unease that began to weave its way into the dark tapestry of her thoughts. Chapter 3, The Watcher on the Threshold. The discovery of the smoke at the edge of the estate did not alter the rhythm of the house, but it altered the rhythm of Elena's mind. The small, moss-covered cottage at the cliff's edge became an anchor for her thoughts during the long, silent hours she spent at her loom. Whenever the tension in the sunroom became too heavy, whenever the sound of Julian's ink pen scratching against drafting paper across the courtyard felt too loud, her gaze would drift out through the salt-crusted glass, searching the southern coastline for that thin, fragile ribbon of blue rising into the gray sky. Julian, meanwhile, seemed to be retreating even deeper into the physical structure of the estate. The microscopic fracture he had discovered in the granite foundation had become an obsession. He spent his mornings in the damp, cool air of the cellars, holding an oil lantern close to the ancient stone walls, mapping the path of the crack with the precision of a surgeon. The cellar smelled of earth, old wine barrels, and the cold, mineral scent of deep rock. For Julian, the darkness down there was comforting. It was a space where the world was reduced to what he could touch and measure. When he returned upstairs in the afternoons, his clothes would carry the chill of the underground, a physical manifestation of the emotional barrier he kept between himself and his wife. He would wash his hands with methodical care, scrubbing the gray stone dust from beneath his fingernails, before returning to his drafting table to calculate the exact composition of the mortar needed to halt the decay. He was trying to save the house, convinced that if he could keep these walls standing, he could keep the chaos of the outside world, and the unraveling of his own interior life, at bay. One morning, a sudden shift in the weather broke the monotony of their isolation. The low, yellow-tinged clouds that had suffocated the peninsula for days were torn apart by a high-altitude wind, revealing a sky of blinding, brilliant blue. The summer sun poured down upon the coast with an unexpected, fierce intensity, transforming the gray Atlantic into a vast field of shimmering, sapphire glass. The wild lavender fields, baked by the sudden heat, released a scent so thick and sweet it made the head spin. The change in light made the interior of the stone house feel unendurable, its dark corridors and shadows suddenly appearing stark and oppressive. Driven by a restless need for air, Elena abandoned her studio early. She chose a path she hadn't taken before, a steep, winding trail that descended through a narrow ravine toward the private cove beneath the southern cliffs. The descent was difficult, the earth was dry and loose, and the jagged granite walls of the ravine radiated the trapped heat of the midday sun. Elena descended slowly, her leather sandals slipping slightly on the gravel, her hand reaching out occasionally to steady herself against the warm rock. As she neared the bottom, the thunderous roar of the ocean grew louder, bouncing off the stone walls until it filled her ears entirely. The cove was a hidden crescent of dark, coarse sand, littered with smooth black pebbles and tangled nests of dried brown kelp that had been baked crisp by the sun. It was completely shielded from the wind by the towering cliffs that curved around it like giant, protective arms. Here, the ocean was calmer, rolling onto the shore in rhythmic, emerald swells that dissolved into hissing white foam. Elena walked along the water's edge, letting the cool foam wash over her bare feet, providing a momentary relief from the oppressive summer heat. For the first time since their arrival, she felt a sensation resembling peace. The sheer scale of the landscape seemed to swallow her personal grief, reducing her fractured marriage to a tiny, insignificant speck in the grand history of the sea and stone. She walked toward the furthest end of the cove, where the shadow of the cliff fell long and dark across the sand. As she rounded a massive boulder that had fallen from the heights years ago, she stopped dead in her tracks. A man was standing near the base of the cliff, right where the path from the moss-covered cottage met the beach. Elena's heart leaped into her throat, its frantic beating loud against the roar of the surf. The stranger was tall, dressed in a loose linen shirt that caught the breeze, his back turned to her. He was staring intensely at a specific section of the cliff face, the very section that formed the outer support of the estate's eastern wing above. In his hand, he held a weathered leather notebook, his fingers resting on the open pages but his eyes fixed on the stone. He didn't move. He stood with a quiet, solid intensity that mirrored the landscape itself, completely absorbed in his observation. There was an air of profound melancholy about his posture, a stillness that suggested he was not merely looking at the rock, but searching for something that had been lost within it. Elena remained frozen in the shadow of the boulder, her breath caught in her lungs. The isolation they had sought had been breached. This man, this secondary presence on their private peninsula, carried an aura of mystery that felt deeply unsettling, yet strangely magnetic. He did not belong to their world of architecture and textiles, yet his presence here, studying the foundation of Julian's sanctuary, felt like an deliberate intrusion. As if sensing her gaze, the man turned his head. His eyes met hers across the expanse of dark sand. They were pale, the color of a winter sea, holding a look of sudden, sharp recognition that startled Elena to her core. It wasn't the look of a stranger surprised by an encounter, it was the look of a man who had been waiting for this exact moment. He did not smile, nor did he make any gesture of greeting. He simply watched her, his gaze steady, heavy with an unspoken weight that seemed to stretch across the distance between them. Panic, sharp and cold, flared within Elena's chest. The intensity of his look was too much to bear, a violation of the safe silence she had grown accustomed to. She took a step back, her heel catching on a smooth stone, before turning and fleeing back the way she came. She ran across the coarse sand, her breath coming in ragged gasps, not looking back until she reached the safety of the ravine path. When she finally reached the top of the cliffs, exhausted and trembling from the heat and the sudden rush of adrenaline, she did not return to her sunroom. Instead, she walked toward the eastern wing, driven by an instinct she couldn't fully explain. She stood at the entrance of Julian's study, looking in through the open doorway. Julian was still there, hunched over his drafting table, his back to her, his ink pen moving with the same rigid precision as before. The pale yellow light of his desk lamp seemed weak and artificial compared to the brilliant summer sun outside. Elena watched him for a long moment, her heart slowly returning to its normal rhythm. She wanted to walk inside, to touch his shoulder, to break the rule of silence and tell him about the man in the cove, about the pale eyes that had looked at her with such haunting familiarity. She wanted to share the burden of this new variable. But as she took a step forward, Julian reached for his ruler, his movements so controlled, so entirely closed off from her, that the words died in her throat. The invisible wall between them remained unyielding. She backed away silently, leaving him to his calculations, carrying the secret of the watcher in the cove back to her own lonely side of the house. Chapter 4, The Rain and the Shadow. The brilliant, blinding sapphire sky of the previous midday did not last. By late afternoon, the high winds had returned, driving a massive wall of dark, violet-tinged storm clouds across the Atlantic. By the time twilight fell, the peninsula was completely enveloped in a relentless, torrential summer rain. It was not a cleansing storm, but a heavy, suffocating downpour that seemed to flatten the wild lavender fields and turn the narrow gravel paths of the estate into rushing streams of muddy water. Inside the grand stone house, the world shrank even further. The rain beat against the tall, narrow granite windows with the sound of 1,000 frantic fingers tapping on the glass. The dampness, always a quiet tenant in the building, became an aggressive force, creeping through the cracked mortar and leaving cold, shimmering tracks on the interior stone walls. In the grand salon, a vast room filled with shrouded furniture and the faded grandeur of a bygone century, a fire had been lit in the massive cavernous hearth. The flames did not bring cheer, instead, they cast long, twisting shadows that danced across the high, vaulted ceiling like restless spirits. The scent of burning pine wood mixed with the ever-present smell of salt and old paper, creating an atmosphere that felt heavy, old, and deeply melancholic. Elena sat in a low, velvet armchair near the edge of the hearth's glow. Her loom had been left in the dark sunroom, but her hands could not remain still. She held a small, silver embroidery hoop, her fingers working a long needle through a piece of dark silk. She wasn't following a pattern. Her needle dipped in and out of the fabric, pulling a pale, silvery thread behind it, creating an erratic, jagged line that looked remarkably like the fractures Julian was mapping in the cellars, or perhaps the silhouette of the rugged cliffs she had fled earlier that day. Her mind was trapped in the memory of the cove. Every time the wind rattled the heavy oak shutters, she saw those pale, winter-sea eyes looking back at her across the dark sand. The stranger's gaze had possessed a gravity that she could still feel pressing against her chest. Who was he? Why did he stand at the base of Julian's wing, staring at the stone foundation with a notebook that seemed to contain its secrets? The questions spun through her mind like a tangled bobbin of thread, each loop leading deeper into a mystery she had no way of solving without breaking the vow of silence that governed the house. Across the room, far outside the circle of the fire's warmth, Julian stood by one of the deeply recessed windows. He had left his drafting table, driven from his calculations by the sheer violence of the rain against the glass. He stood with his hands locked behind his back, his profile illuminated only by the intermittent flashes of lightning that turned the window pane into a sheet of silver. He was not looking at the storm. He was watching the reflection of the room in the dark glass. Through the transparency of the wet pane, he could see the flickering embers of the fire, the long shadows on the wall, and Elena. From his position in the darkness, he watched the rhythmic, steady movement of her arm as she pulled the needle through the silk. He watched the way the firelight caught the curve of her neck, the deep sorrow in the slope of her shoulders. An agonizing ache blossomed in his chest, a physical weight that made it difficult to draw breath. He knew every line of her face, knew the precise texture of her skin, yet she had never felt more distant. They were sharing the same room, breathing the same air, warmed by the same fire, yet they were separated by an ocean of unspoken truths and ancient grief. He wanted to cross the room. He wanted to kneel beside her chair, take the silver hoop from her hands, and bury his face in her lap until the rain stopped and the world made sense again. But the memory of what lay buried beneath his meticulous calculations held him fast. A secret weight, cold and unyielding as the granite foundation below, kept his feet anchored to the floorboards. He could not move toward her because to move toward her meant allowing the walls of his fortress to crumble, and he was terrified of what would be left of them both if the truth ever broke free. So, he remained a shadow at the window, a silent guardian of his own isolation. As the night deepened, the storm reached its peak. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the southern side of the house, causing the heavy timber shutters to rattle with a deafening crack. A draft swept through the grand salon, causing the single candle on the mantelpiece to gutter and die, leaving the room illuminated only by the dying red glow of the hearth. In that sudden shift of light, Elena paused, her needle hovering a millimeter above the silk. She did not look up, but she felt Julian's presence shift. The shadow by the window had moved. Slowly, without a sound, Julian walked across the creaking floorboards. He did not approach her directly, but stopped at the opposite side of the hearth, leaning his arm against the heavy stone mantel. The red embers threw sharp, dramatic angles across his face, emphasizing the deep hollows of his cheeks and the rigid tension in his jaw. For several long minutes, neither of them moved. The only sound was the rhythmic thrumming of the rain and the slow hiss of the dying logs. They were two statues frozen in a timeless purgatory, looking into the fire but seeing only each other in the periphery of their vision. Elena's hand began to tremble slightly. The proximity of his body, the familiar scent of rain and gray stone dust that clung to his coat, was an intoxicating torture. She slowly lowered the embroidery hoop to her lap, her fingers smoothing the dark silk, a silent signal that she was listening, that she was there, waiting for him to break, waiting for him to allow her into the dark spaces of his mind. Julian looked down at her hands. He saw the silver rings catching the red glow of the coals. He saw the tiny tremor in her fingers. He closed his eyes, his knuckles gripping the stone mantelpiece so hard the joints turned white. The silence between them grew so taut it felt as though a single breath would snap it. The words were there, hovering just beneath the surface of his lips, an apology, a confession, a plea for salvation. But the moment stretched too far, becoming too heavy to sustain. The fire gave a final, soft pop, a shower of tiny orange sparks rising up the chimney before dying into black ash. The warmth in the room began to slip away, replaced by the persistent, creeping chill of the coastal night. With a slow, deliberate movement that felt like a final surrender, Julian straightened his posture. He did not look at her face. He turned away from the hearth and walked back into the darkness of the corridor, his footsteps fading until they were entirely swallowed by the sound of the rain. Left alone in the dimming salon, Elena drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She looked down at her embroidery hoop. In the dark, she could not see the silver thread, but her fingers traced the jagged, fractured lines she had woven into the silk. It was a map of their evening, a beautiful, tragic near collision that had ended, once again, in the familiar safety of the dark. Chapter 5, The Intrusion of True Color. The morning after the storm brought no relief from the humidity, only a change in the quality of the light. The sun rose behind a thick, milky film of clouds, casting a flat, pearlescent glare over the peninsula that made every object appear sharp-edged and drained of its natural hue. The gravel courtyard was still deeply puddled with muddy water, reflecting the white sky like shards of a broken mirror. Elena returned to her sunroom early, her fingers moving with a more desperate friction across the treadles of her loom. The jagged silver line she had embroidered the night before seemed to have transferred itself into her work on the tapestry. Her latest rows of wool were tight, uneven, and dense. The silence of the house had changed after the near collision by the hearth. It no longer felt like a protective vacuum, it felt like a pressure chamber, expanding against the stone walls until her ears rang with the sheer density of it. Then, the iron gates at the edge of the estate grounds screamed. The sound was so sudden, so entirely alien to the acoustic landscape of the past 2 weeks, that Elena's foot froze on the wooden pedal. The high-pitched screech of rusty iron hinges cut through the rhythmic thrumming of the distant surf like a physical blade. A moment later, the low, wet rumble of an automobile engine vibrated through the gravel of the courtyard, stopping directly beneath the front windows of the grand salon. Elena stood up slowly, her limbs stiff from hours at the loom. She walked to the warped glass of the sunroom, her heart initiating a rapid, erratic rhythm. Visitors did not come to this edge of the world. Their retreat was a secret shared only with the lawyers who managed the estate and the ghosts of Julian's past. Through the distortion of the pane, she saw a sleek, modern car, its bright crimson paint a shocking, almost violent violation of the estate's muted palette of slate and granite. The door opened, and a woman stepped out into the damp, heavy air. It was Vivian. Elena's breath caught in her throat, a cold weight settling behind her ribs. Her sister did not belong to this landscape of stone and shadow. Vivian was a creature of the city's highest, most frantic social circles, always draped in fabrics that whispered wealth, her movements sharp, calculated, and theatrical. Even now, stepping onto the wet gravel of Brittany, she wore an immaculate, tailored linen suit of an uncompromising cream color, her dark hair swept up into a flawless, rigid style that defied the coastal wind. She did not look like someone who had come to offer comfort, she looked like an executioner arriving to read a verdict. Julian emerged from the front doors before Vivian could reach the stone steps. Elena watched from her hidden vantage point as her husband halted on the threshold. His posture was instantly defensive, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted, his arms remaining straight at his sides. The contrast between them was stark, Julian in his dark, salt-damp wool coat, a man trying to melt into the grey stone of his fortress, and Vivian, a sharp, ivory wedge cutting through the fog. No words were exchanged that Elena could hear, but the nonverbal exchange between Julian and Vivian was a symphony of ancient tension. Vivian did not offer a sisterly embrace. She stopped 3 paces below him on the steps, tilted her head, and let her gaze slide slowly down his frame, her lips curving into a cold, knowing smile that made Elena's stomach turn. Julian's jaw tightened so severely that a small muscle began to throb in his cheek. He did not step aside to welcome her, he simply stood there, a human barricade, until Vivian lifted a single, manicured hand and pointed toward the heavy leather trunk in the back of her car. The intrusion was absolute. Within an hour, the quiet geometry of the house was shattered by Vivian's presence. She did not merely occupy space, she colonized it. Her heavy, gold-trimmed luggage was left in the grand hall, its expensive leather smelling of synthetic perfumes and city smoke, overpowering the old cedar and brine. Elena descended the stone staircase slowly, her hand gripping the cold balustrade. When her eyes met Vivian's in the center of the hall, her sister did not rush to her with words of sympathy. Instead, Vivian stood by the dark fireplace, holding a small silver compact, checking her reflection in the glass. She looked up as Elena reached the final step, her eyes narrow and analytical, assessing the dark circles under Elena's eyes and the plain, unadorned linen of her dress. Vivian walked toward her, her high heels clicking with a deafening, metallic precision against the flagstones. She reached out, her fingers, cold and heavy with rings, brushing against Elena's cheek in a gesture that felt less like affection and more like an inspection of property. She smiled, a small, tight movement of her red lips that did not reach her eyes, before turning away to inspect the room, her hand trailing along the back of a shrouded armchair, leaving a clean track in a thin layer of gray dust. Julian stood in the doorway of the corridor, watching them both. The presence of Vivian had altered the air pressure in the room, the silence between Julian and Elena, which had been a private bridge of shared suffering, was now crowded by a third observer. Vivian walked between them with a restless, prowling energy, her cream suit catching the pale light from the windows as she looked from Julian's rigid frame to Elena's guarded posture. She knew something. The realization hit Elena with the force of a physical blow. Vivian had not driven across the country on a whim of family devotion. The way her sister's gaze lingered on Julian, the way she seemed to take a quiet, sadistic pleasure in the suffocating tension that filled the hall, suggested she was there to witness the results of a fire she had helped light. As the afternoon dissolved into a heavy, yellow twilight, Vivian walked to the tall windows facing the southern cliffs. She stood there for a long time, her fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic pattern against the glass, her eyes fixed on the distant coastline where the smoke from the moss-covered cottage usually rose. She turned back toward Julian, her eyebrows lifting in a silent, mocking question. Julian immediately turned his back to her, retreating into the shadows of the eastern wing with a speed that looked dangerously like panic. The house was no longer their sanctuary, and the silence was no longer their own. A spectator had entered the theater of their misery, and the first act of their carefully guarded lie was beginning to unravel under her cold, theatrical gaze. Chapter 6, The Poisoned Feast. The evening arrived with a heavy, atmospheric suffocating quality that seemed to press the very walls of the estate closer together. Outside, the yellow twilight lingered like a stagnant stain over the Atlantic, refusing to bleed into a clean night. Inside, the grand dining room had been prepared for a ritual that felt more like a courtroom trial than a family dinner. Elena had spent the final hours of the afternoon laying out the table with an almost robotic precision. She used the finest porcelain the house possessed, plates of a translucent white so fragile they looked like shaved bone, and heavy silver cutlery that had turned slightly dark with age and salt air. In the center of the table, she placed 3 tall, ivory-colored candles. When she struck the match, the flame flared up with a sharp, sulphurous hiss, casting a harsh, unyielding light onto the dark, polished oak surface below. Vivian was the first to take her seat. She had changed for the evening into a silk dress of a deep, midnight emerald that shimmered with an oily sheen under the candlelight. Her presence at the table was an act of deliberate, theatrical dominance. She sat perfectly erect, her elbows tracking the edge of the wood, her fingers playing with the stem of a heavy crystal wine glass. She did not look at the food Elena had prepared, her eyes were fixed entirely on the empty chair at the head of the table, waiting for the master of the house to appear. When Julian finally entered the room, his footsteps were slow, heavy, and deliberate. He had not changed his clothes, he still wore the same dark, high-collared wool vest that he had used in the damp cellars, a garment that smelled faintly of gray stone dust and ancient earth. He took his position at the head of the table, his posture so rigid he looked like a statue carved from the very granite he spent his days analyzing. He did not look at Elena as she sat down across from him, nor did he acknowledge Vivian's mocking smile. He simply stared down at his empty plate, his hands flat on the table, his knuckles white against the dark wood. The meal began in an atmosphere of dense, paralyzing friction. Elena moved with a slow, cautious grace, passing the platters of summer vegetables and roasted fish, her silver rings clicking against the porcelain with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. No one ate. The food lay untouched on their plates, cooling into a congealed, unappealing mass as the candles burned down, dripping paths of hot wax onto the polished oak. Vivian was the conductor of this silent torment. She did not need words to inflict damage. With a slow, fluid movement, she reached into her small velvet evening bag and produced a gold-plated lighter and a slim cigarette. She flicked the wheel, the bright orange flame illuminating the sharp, predatory angles of her face for a brief second before she blew a long, lazy plume of gray smoke across the table. The smoke drifted directly into Julian's space, curling around his head like a spectral hand. Julian did not move. He did not blink. But the muscle in his cheek began to throb with a rhythmic, frantic intensity, a physical manifestation of a rage, or a terror, that was rapidly reaching its boiling point. Vivian's gaze never left him. She leaned forward slightly, her green silk dress rustling against the chair, and lifted her wine glass in a silent, mocking toast. She tilted her head toward the eastern wing of the house, then turned her eyes slowly toward the southern window, where the dark coastline lay hidden in the night. The message was unmistakable, a silent arrow aimed directly at the secret Julian thought he had buried at the edge of the peninsula. She was telling him, with every slow blink of her eyes, that she knew about the moss-covered cottage. She knew about the watcher in the cove. And she knew exactly why Julian had brought his wife to this specific, isolated piece of earth. Elena watched the exchange from her side of the table, her breath shallow and tight in her throat. She looked from her sister's cruel, triumphant expression to her husband's frozen, agonizing mask. The realization that she was a blind participant in a private war between them settled into her chest like a block of ice. The silence was no longer a bridge between her and Julian, it was a weapon Vivian was using to cut them both to pieces. Elena's hands began to shake so violently she had to drop her linen napkin to the floor to hide the tremor. She wanted to stand up, to overturn the heavy oak table, to smash the bone-white porcelain against the granite walls, anything to shatter the suffocating illusion of this dinner. She looked at Julian, her eyes pleading with him to look back, to offer her a single glance of solidarity, a silent assurance that they could weather this intrusion together. But Julian remained a fortress of stone. He refused to look at his wife, terrified that if he met her eyes, the guilt would spill out of him like water from a cracked dam. Instead, he slowly lifted his head and met Vivian's gaze directly. The collision between them was electric, a silent explosion of ancient hatred and unspoken threats that filled the room with a terrifying density. Julian's eyes narrowed, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard the wood groaned beneath his fingers. He was a man cornered by his own history, facing the architect of his ruin across a table laid by the woman he loved. Vivian met his anger with a soft, silent laugh that showed the tips of her teeth. She took a final drag from her cigarette, stubbed it out directly into the center of her untouched plate, ruining the white porcelain with a black, oily smudge, and stood up. Her emerald dress caught the candlelight one last time as she turned and walked out of the room, her high heels clicking a slow, triumphant rhythm down the dark corridor, leaving the echo of her intrusion to hang in the air like poison. Chapter 7, The Left-Behind Specimen. The heavy, unyielding tension of the dinner party did not dissipate into the night, it settled into the very floorboards of the estate, making the next morning feel sluggish and thick. The summer sun returned with a muted, silver glare, baking the damp earth until a low, warm mist rose from the lavender fields, blurring the edges of the paths and making the long walks across the grounds feel like moving through a dream. Elena left the house before the others had even opened their shutters. She could not bear the thought of encountering Vivian in the corridors, nor could she handle the sight of Julian's closed door, behind which he remained locked like a prisoner awaiting execution. She walked with a hurried, restless stride down the southern path, her linen skirt sweeping through the damp sea grass, her eyes fixed on the lower cove. Her soul demanded space, a horizon that wasn't hemmed in by stone walls and cold glances. The descent into the ravine was cooler than the upper cliffs, the steep granite walls holding the shadow of the early morning. When her feet finally touched the dark, coarse sand of the beach, she let out a long, shuddering breath. The tide was far out, exposing a vast, glistening field of wet black boulders covered in green anemones and dark ribbons of kelp. The ocean was a distant, rhythmic murmur, a soothing contrast to the sharp, artificial silence of the Grand Salon. She walked slowly along the shoreline, her bare feet sinking into the cool, damp sand. Her steps led her instinctively toward the far end of the cove, the place where she had encountered the stranger 2 days before. She did not expect to see him, the hour was too early, the mist too thick, but her eyes searched the base of the cliff regardless, drawn by a magnetic curiosity she couldn't fully suppress. The beach was empty. The towering cliffs rose vertically into the gray sky, cold and indifferent. Elena stopped near the massive boulder where she had hidden during their first encounter. The sand here was disturbed, showing the faint, half-washed-out imprints of heavy boots. The stranger had been here again, perhaps only hours before her arrival. As she looked down at the tracks, a glint of metallic silver caught her eye. Tucked into a small, dry crevice where the boulder met the sand was an object. Elena knelt, her knees sinking into the damp earth, and reached her hand into the dark opening. Her fingers closed over a cold, heavy cylinder. It was a vintage fountain pen. She pulled it out into the light, holding it flat in her palm. The pen was an antique, made of heavy sterling silver that had turned dark with a rich, velvety patina in the grooves of its intricate engraving. It was a beautiful, functional tool, but as Elena turned it over, her thumb brushed against a smooth, polished section near the cap. There, etched into the silver with a delicate, precise hand, were 2 initials, J.A. Elena's heart gave a sudden, violent leap against her ribs, the blood rushing into her ears until the sound of the distant surf vanished entirely. J.A. Julian. She stared at the initials, her breath turning shallow and ragged. Julian did not use fountain pens, he used modern, fine-tipped technical ink pens for his blueprints, rigid and uniform. Yet, the weight of the object, the style of the engraving, and the precise arrangement of the letters carried the unmistakable hallmark of her husband's family lineage. This was not a tool that belonged to a stranger renting a cottage, this was a relic from Julian's own history, a piece of a past he had never shared with her. How had the stranger come to possess it? Why had he left it here, tucked into the very rock where he knew she had been watching him? The realization that the watcher in the cove wasn't an accidental interloper, but a living link to Julian's hidden world, sent a wave of vertigo through her. The small silver cylinder in her hand felt heavier than a block of granite, a physical fragment of a lie that was beginning to fracture the neat boundaries of her life. The stranger hadn't lost the pen, he had planted it. It was a silent message, a visual bait dropped into her path to ensure she would not look away. Elena stood up, her legs trembling slightly beneath her. She clutched the pen tightly in her fist, the sharp metal edges digging into her palm, a comforting sting of reality in the middle of the surreal mist. She looked up at the high cliff face, toward the eastern wing where Julian's study sat. From this perspective, the house looked ancient, a monolithic fortress built to protect a secret that was now leaking out from its very base. She did not return to the beach. Instead, she climbed the ravine path with a frantic, breathless energy, her mind spinning with 1,000 silent deductions. She did not go to her sunroom. She walked straight into the grand hall of the house, her boots tracking dark sand across the clean flagstones. Julian was standing at the foot of the stone staircase, holding a small wooden box of tools, his face pale and exhausted from another night of sleepless calculations. He looked up as the front doors slammed shut, his dark eyes instantly locking onto Elena's disheveled appearance, her hair wild from the wind, her skirt damp with sea spray. Elena walked directly to him. She did not speak. She stopped 2 paces away, her breath coming in short, audible gasps, and slowly uncurled her fingers, exposing the silver fountain pen in the palm of her hand. The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. Julian's gaze dropped to her open hand. The moment his eyes registered the dark patina of the silver and the engraved initials, every ounce of color drained from his face. His dark eyes widened in an expression of raw, unadulterated horror, a look of a man seeing a ghost materialize from the floorboards. The wooden toolbox slipped from his fingers, hitting the stone floor with a deafening crash, scattering brass screws, rulers, and chisels across the flagstones like shrapnel. He did not reach for the pen. He took a sharp step back, his breath escaping his lips in a silent, choked gasp. His hands shook so violently he had to press them against the banister of the stairs to steady himself. The meticulous, unyielding architect was completely gone. In his place stood a man utterly unraveled by a single piece of silver. Elena watched him, her own heart breaking at the sight of his terror. She wanted to drop the pen, to throw her arms around him, to wash away the guilt that was clearly suffocating him. But before she could move, a soft, dry rustle of silk sounded from the upper landing. Vivian stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the wreckage in the hull. She did not say a word, but as her eyes traveled from the silver pen in Elena's hand to Julian's trembling, broken posture, her lips curled into that familiar, triumphant smile. She leaned against the railing, her green silk dress catching the pale light, watching the execution of the secret with the quiet satisfaction of a general whose trap had just sprung perfectly. Chapter 8, The Hypervigilant Sentinel. The dropped toolbox remained where it had fallen on the flagstones for hours, its scattered brass screws and steel chisels reflecting the flat, white glare of the midsummer sun like tiny metallic teeth. No one picked them up. To clear the mess would be to acknowledge the moment it was made, and the house was currently sustained entirely by the desperate preservation of illusions. By noon, a dramatic shift occurred in Julian's demeanor. The raw, unadulterated horror that had paralyzed him at the sight of the silver fountain pen did not soften into grief, instead, it hardened into a cold, hypervigilant mania. The meticulous architect who had spent weeks quietly mapping microscopic fractures in the relative safety of the cellars had vanished. In his place was a sentinel, a man possessed by a frantic, defensive urgency that bordered on madness. He abandoned his drafting table in the eastern wing entirely. His technical drawings and blueprints were left exposed to the humid air, their edges curling upward as the salt moisture seeped through the open windows. Julian spent the long, hot hours of the afternoon patrolling the perimeter of the estate grounds, his movements rapid, irregular, and sharp. Elena watched him from the high arched windows of her sunroom, her fingers resting heavily against the wooden frame of her loom, the shuttle completely forgotten in her lap. Her husband walked the boundaries of the cliffs like a wolf guarding a threatened den. He would stride down the northern path, his dark wool vest discarded in favor of a sweat-stained linen shirt, his eyes sweeping the horizon with a frantic, scanning motion. He would stop at every vantage point, his body rigid, his hands gripping the iron railings until his knuckles turned the color of bone, staring down into the empty coves below. He was looking for the stranger. He was looking for Leon, though the name remained unspoken, a heavy anchor dragging behind his every step. The presence of the fountain pen had proved to him that the isolation of the peninsula was a lie. The ghost he had been fleeing had not merely followed him to Brittany, it had arrived before him, tunneling under the very foundations of his sanctuary. Julian's hypervigilance extended to the house itself. He began checking the heavy oak doors and window latches multiple times an hour, his footsteps echoing a frantic, irregular rhythm through the corridors. He would enter a room, his dark eyes wide and scanning, verify the locks with a sharp, aggressive twist of his wrist, and exit without acknowledging Elena's presence. It was as if he were trying to seal the granite fortress against an invisible gas, unaware that the poison was already inside, breathing the same air, sitting at the same table. Vivian observed his unraveling with a quiet, detached amusement that felt profoundly sinister. She did not follow him, nor did she attempt to interfere with his manic patrols. Instead, she spent the afternoon on the crumbling stone terrace, reclined in a wicker chaise lounge, her deep emerald silk dress draped around her like the scales of a sleeping serpent. She held a book in her lap but rarely turned the pages. Her eyes followed Julian's frantic shape as he moved back and forth along the cliff paths, her lips curved into that small, cold smile of a spectator watching a perfectly orchestrated tragedy unfold exactly as she had designed. Elena felt the suffocating pressure of their dual movements, Julian's frantic friction and Vivian's frozen satisfaction, pressing against her from both sides. She looked down at her own hands, which still carried the phantom weight of the silver pen. She had hidden the cylinder inside a hollow beam beneath her loom, a secret cache of explosive truth that she was terrified to touch again. The pen had changed everything. It had transformed her sorrow from a private, marital drift into a hostage situation where she was the only captive who didn't know the ransom demands. As the afternoon dissolved into a suffocating, yellow twilight, the heat peaked, trapping a dense, heavy humidity beneath the clouds. The scent of the lavender fields became almost rancid, a sweet, rotting perfume that filled the hot air until it was difficult to draw a clean breath. Julian's patrols did not cease as the light faded. He stood at the highest point of the southern cliffs, a dark silhouette against the bleeding orange horizon. The wind had died down completely, leaving the Atlantic flat and silent, a vast sheet of dark glass that mirrored the heavy sky. He was not looking at the sea, his gaze was fixed entirely on the small, moss-covered cottage wedged into the rocks below. From her window, Elena saw the thin trail of blue smoke begin to rise from the cottage chimney once more, a fragile ribbon cutting through the stagnant twilight. Julian saw it too. Elena watched as his entire body convulsed with a sudden, rigid tremor. He took a sharp step toward the edge of the precipice, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, his chest heaving as if he were about to scream into the void. For a long, terrifying minute, he hung on the threshold of the drop, a man balanced between the defense of his secrets and the desire to plunge directly into the destruction awaiting him below. He did not jump, nor did he descend the path. He simply stood there, a frozen monument of terror, watching the smoke rise from the hearth of the man who held his past in his hands. Chapter 9, The Cornered Prey. The night did not bring a cooling of the atmosphere, instead, it acted as a heavy wool blanket thrown over the stagnant midsummer heat. The estate was cast into a deep, velvety darkness, illuminated only by the occasional, silent flare of heat lightning on the distant Atlantic horizon. Inside the eastern wing, the air was thick with the scent of dried ink, old parchment, and the metallic tang of the oil lamp Julian had lit upon his return from the cliffs. He sat at his drafting table, but the rulers and compasses were no longer his defense. He was hunched over the smooth wood, his head buried in his hands, his fingers digging into his hair as if he could physically claw out the memories that the silver fountain pen had brought back to the surface. The light from the brass lamp was low and flickering, throwing long, monstrous shadows of his crooked silhouette against the stone walls of the study. He was a man completely spent, his hypervigilant mania having collapsed under the sheer, unyielding weight of his exhaustion. The door to the study did not creak, it swung open with a smooth, silent fluidity that felt like a draft of cold air entering a tomb. Julian did not lift his head immediately, perhaps believing the intrusion was merely another trick of his sleep-deprived mind. But then the soft, rhythmic rustle of expensive silk cut through the silence. Vivian stepped into the room, her deep emerald dress shimmering like stagnant water in the weak lamplight. She did not hesitate on the threshold, she moved with the slow, predatory confidence of a creature that had finally tracked its prey to a dead-end canyon. She walked around the perimeter of the room first, her manicured fingers trailing along the edges of Julian's bookcases, her rings clicking softly against the leather bindings of his architecture texts. She was tasting the atmosphere, feeding on the palpable terror that radiated from his rigid frame. Julian slowly raised his head, his face appearing hollow, aged by 10 years in the span of a single day. His dark eyes were bloodshot, fixed on her with a mixture of profound hatred and absolute vulnerability. Vivian stopped directly across from him, leaning her hands flat against the edge of the drafting table, tilting her head forward into the circle of light. The shadow cast by her nose stretched long across his neat technical drawings, cutting through a meticulously drawn blueprint like an ink stain. She did not speak. To speak would be to give him an opportunity to answer, to defend, to negotiate. Instead, she let her eyes do the executioner's work. Slowly, deliberately, Vivian reached into the pocket of her emerald dress. She produced a small, folded piece of yellowed paper, a cutting from a metropolitan newspaper from years ago, its edges frayed and delicate. She laid it flat on the blueprint between them, her index finger tapping the center of the text with a rhythmic, torturous precision. Julian's gaze dropped to the paper. Even in the dim light, he didn't need to read the words, he knew the shape of the headline by heart. It was the public record of the tragedy, the announcement of the drowning of Leon's sister, the woman Julian had loved before the world fractured. Vivian's finger slid across the paper, pointing to the date, then shifted to point directly at Julian's chest, and finally, she gestured with a slow, sweeping motion toward the western wing where Elena lay sleeping. The silent accusation was total. She was reminding him of the sequence, the death, the grief, and the swift, calculated way she had stepped into the wreckage to guide Julian toward her sister, ensuring Elena would become the plaster used to fill the cracks in his broken life. She was showing him that she held the puppet strings of his marriage, that she had always known his love for Elena was a structure built over a grave. Julian's breath escaped his lips in a sharp, rattling hiss. He slammed his hands down onto the table, standing up so violently that the brass lamp rocked on its base, sending wild, chaotic shadows spinning across the ceiling. He leaned over the wood, his face inches from hers, his chest heaving as if he were suffocating. The rage in his eyes was blinding, a desperate, animal urge to strike back at the phantom that was destroying him. Vivian did not flinch. She did not take a step back. She met his fury with a cold, unyielding stare, her lips widening into that slow, cruel smile that showed the tips of her teeth. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the edge of the newspaper clipping, and then she made a sharp, tearing motion in the air with her hands. The message was absolute, with a single gesture, she could rip the illusion apart. She could take that piece of paper, take the silver fountain pen, and lay them at Elena's feet, destroying the fragile piece Julian had sacrificed his sanity to protect. She was giving him his verdict in the shadows of his own sanctuary, he was a prisoner of her silence, and the price of his freedom was the total surrender of his soul. From the dark corridor outside, a shadow shifted. Elena stood in the deep recess of the hallway, her body pressed against the cold stone wall, her eyes peering through the crack of the heavy oak door. She had followed the rustle of Vivian's dress through the house, driven by an instinct that refused to let her remain blind any longer. She watched the silent drama unfold in the circle of lamplight, the yellowed newspaper, Julian's violent rise, Vivian's tearing gesture. She did not know the specific words of the lie, but she saw the shape of the leverage. She saw her husband, the man of unyielding stone, completely broken, reduced to a trembling captive before her sister's emerald silhouette. The realization that her entire life with Julian was a currency being traded in the dark between them settled into her bones like an incurable frost, leaving her standing in the shadows, a ghost witnessing her own execution. Chapter 10, The Golden Mirage. The midsummer sun reached its absolute zenith, shedding its watery, misty skin and baking the Brittany peninsula in a fierce, unyielding crucible of light. The Atlantic was no longer slate gray or sapphire, it had become a vast, blinding sheet of molten silver that hurt the eyes to look at directly. The heat rose from the granite courtyard invisible, shimmering waves, trapping the heavy, bittersweet perfume of the lavender fields until the air felt thick enough to taste. Inside the estate, the shadows retreated into the deepest corners, leaving the grand rooms exposed to a breathless, suffocating brightness. Driven from her sunroom by the baking heat of the glass panels, Elena walked the long, silent corridors of the western wing. Her mind was a chaotic tangle of threads she could no longer untangle. The image of the yellowed newspaper clipping in Vivian's hand, the look of complete defeat on Julian's face, and the cold, emerald presence of her sister hovering over their lives like a vulture had robbed her of sleep. She was moving through her own life like a phantom, her fingers tracing the rough stone walls as she walked, searching for something solid to hold onto in a world that felt increasingly like an illusion. She entered the grand library, a room typically ignored during their retreat, where the high windows were shaded by heavy, dark velvet drapes. The air here was cooler, smelling of old leather, vanilla, and dust. As her eyes adjusted to the dimness, she realized she was not alone. Julian was sitting on the floor, his back pressed against the lower shelves of a towering bookcase, his knees pulled up to his chest. His linen shirt was wrinkled, his dark hair damp with sweat, and his hands were completely empty. There were no blueprints, no rulers, no tools around him. For the first time since they had arrived at the coast, he was completely unarmored, stripped of the professional distractions he used as a fortress. He looked up as the door clicked shut, his dark eyes wide, vulnerable, and completely hollowed out by the psychological warfare of the past days. Elena stopped on the threshold, her breath catching in her throat. The sight of him so thoroughly broken pierced through her growing resentment, reaching the deep, foundational love that had bound them together before the silence took over. She did not think about Vivian, or the silver pen, or the watcher in the cove. She saw only her husband, a man suffocating under a weight he was trying to carry alone. Slowly, deliberately, she crossed the room. The floorboards did not creak beneath her bare feet. She knelt beside him on the Persian rug, her linen skirt pooling around her like a white cloud. Julian did not move away. He did not tighten his jaw or look toward the door. He simply watched her approach, his chest heaving with a slow, shallow rhythm. Elena reached out her hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched his cheek, her palm pressing against the rough stubble of his jawline. The heat of his skin was intense, a sharp contrast to the cold stone of the house. Julian's eyes closed at the contact. A long, shuddering breath escaped his lips, a sound of profound, agonizing relief. The simple, nonverbal touch seemed to break a valve inside him. He reached up, his large, rough hand closing over hers, pressing her palm tighter against his face as if he were trying to draw her very strength into his bones. Without a word, the distance that had kept them apart for months dissolved in a sudden, desperate flash of friction. Julian turned toward her, his arms wrapping around her waist with a fierce, almost violent intensity, pulling her body against his chest. Elena clung to him just as tightly, her fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt, burying her face in the hollow of his neck where the scent of salt air and skin was intoxicatingly warm. It was a desperate, breathless collision, a sudden flowering of passion in the middle of a desert. They moved together on the floor of the dim library, driven not by a celebration of their love, but by a frantic, mutual terror. They were two drowning swimmers clinging to one another in a stormy sea, each trying to use the other's body as a life raft against the wreckage they knew was coming. Julian kissed her with a raw, bruising hunger, his lips moving over her face, her neck, her shoulders, as if he could physically erase the presence of Vivian and the ghost of Leon with the sheer force of his touch. Elena gave herself over to the madness entirely. In his arms, the suffocating silence of the estate transformed into a loud, thumping symphony of heartbeats and ragged breaths. She did not care that this passion was born of fear, she did not care that he was hiding a tragedy from her. In this golden, breathless midsummer afternoon, within the shaded sanctuary of the library, she allowed herself to believe the mirage. She allowed herself to feel loved, to feel wanted, to believe that the foundation of their marriage was still strong enough to withstand the earthquake that was fracturing their lives from below. They lay together for a long time afterward on the heavy rug, the pale streaks of golden sunlight that managed to pierce the drapes slowly shifting across their intertwined limbs. Julian's head rested on Elena's chest, his breathing finally slowing into a peaceful rhythm, his hand loosely holding her silver rings. Elena ran her fingers through his damp hair, her eyes staring up at the high ceiling. The peace was absolute, but it was a fragile, temporary peace, a beautiful lie agreed upon by two souls who were too tired to fight the truth. Outside the shaded library, the sun began its slow, heavy descent toward the Atlantic, the golden light turning a deep, warning orange. The heat peaked, and with it, the brief illusion of safety began to melt away, leaving the heavy scent of the lavender fields to seep back through the cracks in the windows, a quiet reminder that the storm was still waiting for them just beyond the door. Chapter 11, The Document of Shattered Mirrors. The fragile warmth of the library floor evaporated the moment the heavy mahogany door clicked open, releasing them back into the unyielding chill of the stone corridor. The golden mirage had passed, leaving behind a sharp, clinical morning light that seemed to expose every speck of dust and every line of strain on the estate's granite face. The afternoon of desperate embrace was gone, replaced by a cold, mutual embarrassment. They had touched the raw center of their fear, and the exposure had terrified them both back into their well-rehearsed distances. Elena retreated to her sunroom, but she did not sit at the loom. Her hands were too unsteady to guide the shuttle, her mind too loud to focus on the predictable geometry of warp and weft. Her gaze was drawn irresistibly downward, out through the salt-encrusted glass toward the southern shoreline. The morning tide was unusually low, leaving a vast expanse of dark, rib-like sandbars exposed to the gray sky. Driven by a restless, pulling curiosity that felt like a thread tightening around her chest, she left the house before the midday heat could trap the air. She did not take the ravine path to the beach this time. Instead, she walked the high cliffside trail that skirted the very boundary of the estate grounds, her leather shoes crunching softly on the dry earth and dried lavender stalks. Her destination was the cleft in the rock, the moss-covered stone cottage where the watcher lived. The cottage was smaller up close, appearing more like a natural growth of the cliff than a human dwelling. The dark slate roof was sagging, covered in thick patches of bright orange lichen and deep green moss that thrived on the salt humidity. The small, square windows were dark, offering no view into the interior. The chimney was cold, the thin trail of blue smoke that usually anchored Elena's gaze had vanished, leaving the air around the structure smelling only of dry sea grass and old rot. Elena approached with a cautious, hunting step, her heart initiating a heavy, rhythmic thumping against her ribs. The small timber door was unlatched, swaying slightly in the light coastal breeze with a low, rhythmic groan. She pushed it open further, the hinges screaming a brief objection before allowing her to step across the threshold into the dark interior. The space was monastic, stripped of comfort, yet entirely consumed by a singular, obsessive purpose. An iron cot stood in the corner, its wool blanket neatly folded. A small stone hearth contained nothing but cold, white ash. But it was the wooden table beneath the window that drew Elena's attention, her breath catching sharply in her throat as she stepped closer. The table was covered in objects that formed a terrifying, disjointed mosaic of her own life. There were sketches of the Brittany estate drawn from every conceivable angle, technical notes on the structural load of the eastern wing, and most devastatingly, scraps of woven textiles, indigo and slate wool threads that perfectly matched the palette of the tapestry currently sitting on her loom. The stranger had not just been watching the house, he had been collecting them, dissecting their routines, gathering the fragments of their isolation like a scientist preparing a display. In the center of this collection lay a large, weathered leather notebook, the same book she had seen the stranger holding in the cove. Elena reached out, her fingers cold and trembling as they touched the cracked leather cover. The material was stiff, stained with salt water and dark ink. She lifted it, the weight of the pages feeling immense, a physical gravity that seemed to tilt the floorboards beneath her feet. She opened the first page. The handwriting was not Julian's rigid, architectural print, nor was it Vivian's sharp, erratic script. It was a fluid, elegant hand, full of loops and dramatic tilts, written in a dark violet ink that had faded to a ghostly lavender over time. The pages were a diary, a chronicle of a summer long past, filled with descriptions of a love that was fierce, young, and tragically brief. As Elena flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the blocks of text without reading the words entirely, she began to notice recurring sketches in the margins. They were drawings of a young woman with a laughing face, her hair wild from the wind, standing on the very cliffs where the estate now sat. Beside one of the sketches, a name was written over and over again, surrounded by tiny, delicate ink drawings of waves, Clara. Elena's thumb slid further down the page, stopping at a loose insertion between the leaves. It was a photograph, its edges curled and yellowed by time. The image depicted three people standing on a sunlit pier, their arms linked, their smiles bright against a background of a sparkling summer sea. On the left was Julian. He was younger, his shoulders less rigid, his face illuminated by a genuine, unburdened smile that Elena had never seen in all her years of marriage. In the center stood the young woman from the sketches, Clara, her eyes crinkled with laughter, her hand holding the very silver fountain pen that Elena had discovered in the cove. And on the right stood the stranger. His face was younger, his hair shorter, but the pale, winter-sea eyes were unmistakable. Leon. The realization hit Elena with the physical force of a wave crashing against her chest, driving the air from her lungs in a sharp, choking gasp. The mosaic came together in a single, terrifying flash of light. The stranger in the cove was not a random interloper, he was the brother of the woman Julian had loved before her. He was the living remnant of a tragedy that Julian had buried beneath his blueprints and calculations, a ghost that had returned to reclaim a debt that had never been paid. Elena stared at the photograph, her tears blurring the three smiling faces until they ran together like wet ink. The golden afternoon in the library, the desperate kisses, the silent assurances of safety, all of it was a beautiful lie, a temporary plaster used to hide a structural failure that went down to the very bedrock of their lives. Julian had not brought her to this coast to save their marriage, he had brought her here because he was haunted, because the memory of Clara was stitched into the very cliffs of this peninsula. She clutched the notebook tightly against her chest, the sharp corners of the leather binding digging into her skin, a grounding sting of pain in the center of her shock. She turned and fled the cottage, spilling out into the bright, clinical glare of the morning, her linen dress catching on the thorny sea holly as she ran back toward the high granite walls of her prison, carrying the full, unvarnished weight of the past in her hands. Chapter 12, The Architect of Shadows. The clinical morning light dissolved into a heavy, suffocating gray afternoon, the sky dropping so low over the peninsula that the granite chimneys of the estate seemed to pierce the underbelly of the clouds. Elena did not return to her sunroom, nor did she hide the weathered leather notebook. She carried it openly through the dark corridors of the house, its salt-stained leather heavy against her ribs, a physical manifestation of the truth that had shattered her fragile peace. She found Vivian exactly where she expected her to be, in the grand salon, sitting before the cold, ash-filled hearth where the near collision between Julian and Elena had occurred nights before. Vivian had not bothered to open the heavy velvet drapes, she sat in the deep shadows, draped in a silk morning gown of an icy, pale blue that looked like a shard of glacier ice against the dark furniture. She was reading a letter, her long, manicured fingers turning the thin paper with a dry, rhythmic rustle that filled the silent room. Elena stepped into the salon, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug, but her presence was instantly registered. Vivian did not look up immediately, but her fingers stopped their rhythmic turning. The air in the room grew instantly cold, the lingering scent of Vivian's expensive city perfume mixing with the raw brine clinging to Elena's dress. Without a word, Elena stepped into the circle of dim light casting from the single window and dropped the leather notebook onto the low mahogany table between them. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that caused Vivian's porcelain teacup to rattle against its saucer. Vivian's gaze traveled slowly from the letter in her lap, across the polished wood, to the stained leather cover. Her expression did not change, her eyebrows did not lift in surprise, nor did her lips tighten in fear. Instead, a slow, deep satisfaction pooled in her dark eyes, a look of a master chess player watching an opponent move a piece into the exact trap prepared for them months ago. Slowly, deliberately, Vivian folded her letter, sliding it into her silk pocket, and leaned forward into the light. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cracked binding of Leon's notebook with a gesture that was almost affectionate. She did not open it, she didn't need to. She knew every secret contained within its pages because she had been the one who ensured those secrets would become weapons. Elena watched her sister's hands, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She needed to know the depth of the betrayal, not through words, but through the evidence of Vivian's own actions. She reached down, took the old newspaper clipping that Vivian had left on Julian's drafting table the night before, which she had retrieved from the corridor floor, and laid it directly on top of the notebook. Then, she gestured with a sharp, sweeping motion toward the upper floorboards where Julian's room lay, and finally, she pointed a trembling finger directly at Vivian's heart. The silent question was total: why did you do this to us? Vivian met her sister's pleading gaze with a cold, unyielding stare. She stood up slowly, the pale blue silk of her gown whispering against the floorboards as she walked to a large, dust-covered writing desk in the corner of the room. She unlocked the top drawer with a small brass key that hung from her wrist, her movements smooth, theatrical, and entirely devoid of remorse. She returned to the table carrying a small, lacquered wooden box. She placed it beside the notebook and lifted the lid, exposing a neat stack of old letters written in Julian's distinctive, rigid architectural print. They were dated 6 years ago, during the immediate aftermath of Clara's drowning. Vivian's fingers slid a single letter from the top of the pile, unfolding it flat before Elena's eyes. She did not allow her to read the text entirely, but her finger pointed to a specific paragraph where Julian had written of his complete, paralyzing desire to join Clara in the dark waters of the Atlantic. He had been a man on the absolute precipice of self-destruction, his soul completely unraveled by grief. Then, Vivian slid another document from beneath the letters, a copy of a financial ledger from their father's estate, dated only weeks after Julian's letters. The ledger showed a massive, unexplained transfer of funds into Julian's failing architectural firm, signed with Vivian's own name. The mosaic of the betrayal was laid bare in the dim, dusty salon. Vivian had not guided Julian into Elena's arms out of sisterly devotion or love, she had bought him. She had used his financial ruin and his blinding grief as leverage, throwing her own sister into the wreckage of his heart to secure her hold over a man whose brilliant talent she wanted to control. Elena had never been the love that saved Julian from his tragedy, she had been the currency Vivian used to pay for his survival, a beautifully packaged distraction designed to keep him anchored to the living world while Vivian held the strings to his fortune and his freedom. Elena took a sharp step back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry that refused to form. The room felt as though it were spinning, the dark mahogany furniture and the heavy velvet drapes closing in on her like the walls of a collapsing tomb. Her entire marriage, every shared look, every silent dinner, even the desperate, golden passion they had shared on the library floor, was a structure built over an abyss of debt, manipulation, and borrowed time. Vivian watched her sister's chest heave, watched the tears finally break from Elena's eyes and track down her pale cheeks. She did not reach out to comfort her. She simply reached down, picked up the silver compact from the table, and checked her reflection in the glass, her red lips curving into a small, tight smile of absolute victory. She had delivered the final, devastating blow without uttering a single word, leaving Elena to suffocate in the silent, beautifully orchestrated wreckage of her own life. Chapter 13, The Midnight Boundary. The gray suffocation of the afternoon did not lift with the setting of the sun, it simply deepened into a dense, ink-black summer night that seemed to erase the boundary between the land and the Atlantic. The humidity reached a breaking point, trapping a heavy, electric stillness over the peninsula. The sea was invisible in the darkness, yet its presence was absolute, a deep, low rumble that vibrated through the granite foundations of the estate like a steady, thumping pulse. Inside his dark study in the eastern wing, Julian did not sleep. The flickering oil lamp had long since burned out, leaving him engulfed in the absolute blackness of the room. He stood by the open window, the hot, salt-laden air brushing against his hollow face, his fingers resting on the stone sill. He was a man suspended in a vacuum. The desperate passion shared with Elena on the library floor had been his final attempt to build a wall against his history, but Vivian's silent exhibition of the past had proved that his fortress was already occupied by the enemy. Driven by an internal pressure that made the stone walls feel as though they were closing in to crush him, Julian stepped through the window frame, lowering himself silently onto the gravel courtyard below. He did not look back at the dark windows of the house where his wife and her sister lay trapped in their own private hells. He began to walk. His steps did not take him on his usual frantic perimeter patrols. Instead, as if pulled by an invisible, tightening wire anchored to the bedrock of his soul, he walked directly down the southern path toward the highest, most precarious point of the cliffs. The tall sea grass brushed against his trousers with a dry, whispering hiss, the only sound breaking the heavy silence of the night besides the distant, booming tide. As he reached the precipice, where the land cut off sharply into a sheer, vertical drop into the churning Atlantic, Julian stopped. The heat lightning flared silently across the distant horizon, a brief, brilliant sheet of violet light that illuminated the landscape for a fraction of a second. In that flash of violet light, Julian realized he was not alone. Standing a mere 5 paces away, right at the very edge of the abyss where the path dissolved into the sky, was the silhouette of a tall man. He stood with his hands loosely in his pockets, his linen shirt catching the faint breeze that always hovered over the drop. Even in the return of the absolute darkness that followed the lightning, Julian didn't need to see his face to know who it was. The spatial orientation of the body, the quiet, unyielding solidity of the posture, it was the ghost that had haunted his blueprints for 6 years. Leon. A sudden, sharp chill cut through the heavy summer heat, wrapping around Julian's ribs like a band of iron. His breath escaped his lips in a slow, ragged hiss that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the surf below. The architect of stone and the guardian of the past stood frozen on the threshold of the world, separated by a handful of steps and an ocean of unspoken grief. They did not rush toward one another. There was no violent collision, no frantic exchange of nonverbal accusations. Instead, they existed as two statues marking the boundary of a shared grave. Julian's hands slowly unclinched at his sides, his fingers hanging limp, the manic defensiveness of his daytime patrols completely evaporating in the presence of the real variable. He was a man who had spent years calculating load-bearing capacities and structural integrity, yet standing before Leon, the absolute failure of his personal architecture was total. He could not build a ceiling high enough to hide from the sky, nor a wall thick enough to lock out the sea. Another flash of heat lightning lit the sky, longer and more intense than the first. In this extended moment of violet clarity, Julian looked directly into Leon's eyes. They were the pale, winter sea eyes he had seen in his nightmares, the same eyes that had looked up from the photograph Elena had discovered in the cottage. Leon's gaze did not hold anger or a desire for vengeance, instead, it carried a profound, bottomless exhaustion that mirrored Julian's own hollow interior. Leon slowly reached into his pocket. He did not pull out a weapon, nor did he brandish a document. He simply withdrew his empty hand and extended it out over the edge of the cliff, his palm flat and open toward the sea below, before slowly closing his fingers into a tight fist and drawing it back to his chest. The gesture was a silent summary of their tragedy. Everything we held has slipped through our fingers into the deep, and what remains is nothing but a closed hand full of air. Julian watched the movement, his chest heaving with a slow, agonizing rhythm. He took a single, small step forward, his boot shifting a loose stone that tumbled over the edge, falling silently into the dark void. He reached his own hand out, matching Leon's gesture, his fingers extending into the hot, empty night air between them, a desperate, silent plea for a connection that the past had rendered impossible. For several minutes, they remained pinned against the dark sky, their extended hands hovering in the space between them like the broken arches of an unfinished bridge. They were tied together by a thread woven from Clara's hair, a thread that Vivian had pulled to spin a web of finance and manipulation around Julian's life. Leon knew what Julian had done, he knew the marriage was a beautiful plaster used to hide the rot. And Julian knew that Leon was there to witness the inevitable collapse of the structure. The heat lightning faded, plunging the cliffside back into a thick, suffocating blackness. The wind suddenly died down completely, leaving the air heavy and dead. When the next silent flash illuminated the peninsula seconds later, the edge of the cliff was empty. Leon was gone, swallowed by the darkness or the narrow paths that led back down to his moss-covered cottage. Julian remained on the threshold alone, his arms still extended out into the empty summer night, his hand cold despite the oppressive heat. He looked down into the black abyss where the waves were striking the stone with a relentless, tragic passion. The encounter had provided no answers, no releases from his prison, it had simply confirmed the verdict. The Watcher was not a threat to be defended against, he was the mirror reflecting the total, beautiful ruin of the life Julian had tried so desperately to construct. Chapter 14, The Stagnant Crucible. The dawn that followed the midnight encounter brought no relief, no fresh breeze to clear the heavy, electric charge from the Brittany Peninsula. Instead, the sun rose as a pale, copper disk, strangled by a thick, amber haze that bled all the color from the Atlantic. By noon, the temperature had climbed to a suffocating peak, transforming the granite estate into a vast, stagnant crucible. The air was entirely devoid of movement, the leaves of the stunted oaks along the driveway hung limp and dusty, and the usually vibrant lavender fields looked parched, their heavy, bittersweet scent curdling in the intense heat until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the lungs. Inside the grand house, the atmosphere had thickened into a tangible, psychological fog. The walls of the estate, designed centuries ago to keep out the harsh coastal winters, were now keeping the suffocating heat trapped inside, along with the unvarnished truths that had shattered the family's peace. No one spoke, no one moved between the rooms with any sense of purpose. The three inhabitants of the house drifted through the corridors like spirits haunting the scene of an ancient disaster, each locked in a private fortress of isolation. Elena spent the long, breathless hours in the central hallway, the coldest part of the house, where the massive stone flags offered a faint, fleeting coolness to her bare feet. The weathered leather notebook she had taken from Leon's cottage remained clamped under her arm, a heavy, solid anchor connecting her to reality. She did not open it again, she did not need to. The image of the yellowed photograph, of a smiling, unburdened Julian standing on a sunlit pier with Clara, was burned into the back of her eyelids. She looked up at the sweeping stone staircase, her gaze tracking the elegant, rising curve of the balustrade that Julian had so meticulously restored. It was a beautiful structure, a testament to his undeniable genius as an architect. But now, knowing the financial ledger that Vivian kept locked in her desk, knowing that her own marriage had been the price paid to fund Julian's survival and his firm, the staircase looked like a magnificent cage. Every polished piece of timber, every precisely cut block of granite in this house had been paid for with the currency of her sister's manipulation and her own ignorance. Further down the hall, the door to the grand salon stood slightly ajar. Through the narrow gap, Elena could see the pale, glacial blue of Vivian's silk morning gown. Vivian had not moved from her position by the shaded window since the previous afternoon. She sat with an antique ivory fan in her lap, its delicate ribs folded tight, completely motionless. She did not need to fan herself, the heat did not seem to affect her. She sat in the shadows like a spider in the center of a perfectly spun web, her dark eyes staring fixedly at the door, waiting with absolute, clinical patience for the final structural failure of the marriage she had manufactured. The tension reached its absolute peak when Julian entered the hallway from the eastern wing. He was drenched in sweat, his linen shirt clinging to his hollow chest, his boots caked with the dry, red earth of the cliffside trail. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, his dark eyes instantly locking onto the leather notebook clutched against Elena's ribs. Elena did not turn away. She stood her ground on the cold stone floor, her chin lifted, her gaze meeting his with a raw, piercing intensity that stripped away the last remaining layers of their carefully maintained pretense. She did not gesture, she did not point toward the salon where Vivian sat. She simply looked at him, her eyes carrying the full, crushing weight of her discovery. I know about Clara. I know about the money. I know what we are. Julian's reaction was instantaneous and devastating. The rigid, architectural posture that had defined him for years, the proud, unyielding carriage of a man who believed he could control the variables of his life, completely collapsed. His shoulders sagged, his jaw slackened, and his hands trembled at his sides. He looked at the notebook, then back at Elena's tear-stained but resolute face, and a look of profound, agonizing defeat washed over his features. The hidden rot at the foundation of his life had finally breached the surface, and he had no calculations, no blueprints, no structural supports left to hold up the ceiling. Without a single sound breaking the heavy, dead silence of the hallway, Julian turned away from his wife. He did not ascend the stairs to his sanctuary, nor did he retreat back into his study. He walked slowly, unsteadily, toward the heavy timber front doors of the estate. He pushed them open, the bright, amber glare of the stagnant afternoon spilling across the stone floor like a splash of acid, and stepped out into the furnace of the courtyard, leaving the door wide open behind him. Elena watched him go, the hot wind from the outside world rushing into the hallway, stirring the dust motes and rustling the pages of the notebook in her arms. The golden mirage of their summer vacation was entirely gone, replaced by a bleak, unyielding clarity. The heat had peaked, the secrets were out, and the three of them were left to suffocate in the silent, beautifully orchestrated wreckage of the life they had tried to construct. Chapter 15, The Breaking of the Glass. The copper sky, which had held the Brittany Peninsula in a breathless, suffocating vice for days, finally began to curdle into a deep, bruised violet along the western horizon. The stagnant, amber haze that had choked the estate vanished in an instant, replaced by a sudden, unnatural drop in pressure that made the ears ring in the dead silence. The ocean, invisible beneath the rising wall of low-slung, charcoal clouds, had ceased its low rumble. It had become an eerie, unmoving mirror, waiting for the first blow to strike. The parched lavender fields stood frozen, their heavy perfume hanging like a static fog over the baking granite stone of the courtyard. Inside the estate, the silence was no longer defensive, it was the tense, vibrating quiet of a fuse burning down to the powder. Elena stood at the foot of the sweeping stone staircase, her bare feet still pressed against the stone flags that had lost their morning coolness. Under her arm, the weathered leather notebook felt like a blocks of lead, its salt-crusted edges digging through the linen of her dress into her skin. Her eyes were fixed on the heavy timber front doors, left wide open by Julian's frantic departure, framing a rectangle of that menacing, violet light. A sudden, sharp vibration shook the air, not the distant roll of heat lightning, but a violent, concussive crack of thunder that seemed to detonate directly over the slate roofs of the house. With that single sound, the wind arrived. It did not rise slowly, it struck the house like a solid, physical wall of cold, brine-saturated air moving at immense speed. The heavy timber doors slammed shut with a deafening report that echoed through the long corridors like a gunshot. In the grand salon, the heavy velvet drapes flared outward, tearing free from their brass tiebacks and lashing against the walls like dark wings. The fragile equilibrium of the stagnant afternoon was instantly shattered, replaced by the chaotic, howling roar of a full Atlantic gale ripping across the cliffs. From her position in the shadows of the salon, Vivian finally moved. The cold, glacial satisfaction that had defined her posture for days vanished, replaced by a sharp, hunting alertness. She stepped through the double doors into the hallway, the pale blue silk of her morning gown whipping violently around her ankles in the drafts that were now whistling through the cracks in the masonry. She did not look at Elena. Her dark eyes were fixed entirely on the windows facing the southern cliffs, her fingers tightening around the ivory ribs of her closed fan until the delicate material groaned under the strain. Elena moved past her sister without a glance, driven by a sudden, terrifying certainty that the storm outside was the final variable Julian could not calculate. She ran up the stone staircase, her feet flying over the steps he had so carefully restored, and pushed open the door to the sunroom. The space was a roaring vortex. One of the massive glass panels on the seaward side had shattered under the initial impact of the gale, scattering a glittering carpet of diamond-sharp shards across the floorboards and over the dark frame of her loom. The wind was howling through the breach, catching the loose indigo and slate-wool threads of her unfinished tapestry, pulling them from the bobbins and whipping them through the air like thin, bleeding veins. Elena ran to the broken window, ignoring the glass that sliced into the soles of her feet. She leaned out into the screaming dark, the driving rain instantly soaking her hair and blinding her eyes with a freezing, salty torrent. Through the sheets of gray water cascading over the cliffs, the horizon flared with a brilliant, continuous sequence of violet lightning. In those jagged, electric illumination loops, she saw the full horror of the peninsula's architecture unraveled. The dark sandbars that had been exposed during the morning tide were being swallowed by a churning, white-crested wall of foam. The sea was reclaiming the land, violent waves throwing themselves against the base of the granite cliffs with enough force to make the bedrock beneath her feet tremble. And there, at the very tip of the southern promontory, standing on the midnight boundary where he had met Leon the night before, was Julian. He was entirely exposed to the fury of the gale, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his linen shirt torn open and flapping wildly against his ribs. He was not looking at the house, nor was he looking for a path down to safety. He was leaning forward into the wind, his arms outstretched toward the roaring abyss, his body tilting at an impossible, dangerous angle over the sheer drop. He looked like a man trying to read a blueprint written in the lightning, an architect trying to calculate the exact moment the stone beneath him would give way and allow him to drop into the dark embrace where Clara had waited for 6 years. Elena let out a silent scream, the sound of her terror completely swallowed by the booming thunder. She turned from the window, the weathered notebook falling from her grip onto the wet, glass-strewn floorboards, its pages fluttering wildly as she fled the sunroom, descending into the dark bowels of the house to race toward the cliffs before the ocean could collect its final, long-overdue debt. Chapter 16, The Gravity of the Torrent. The heavy timber front doors of the estate, having been violently thrown open by the pressure of the storm, offered no resistance as Elena threw herself out into the dark crucible of the courtyard. The transition from the shelter of the stone hallways to the unbridled fury of the Atlantic gale was a physical blow that nearly drove her to her knees. The air was no longer a gas, it had become a dense, roaring fluid composed of freezing rain, stinging salt spray, and torn bits of coastal vegetation that whipped across the granite flags like shrapnel. The violet glare of the continuous lightning cast long, erratic shadows that stretched and warped across the drowning landscape, making the very earth appear to heave underfoot. Elena did not pause to look back at the high, dark windows of the house, where she knew Vivian still stood watching from the shelter of the salon. She pulled the sodden fabric of her linen dress tight around her limbs, her bare feet slipping on the slick, mud-slicked stones of the courtyard as she crossed the threshold into the wild heath. The manicured paths of the estate had already dissolved under the torrential downpour, turning into small, rushing torrents of red clay that tore at her ankles and threatened to pull her down into the dark earth. The ascent toward the southern promontory was a vertical battle against gravity and the wind. The gale blew directly off the ocean, striking her chest with enough force to freeze the breath in her lungs. She was forced to lean nearly double, her fingers clawing at the rough, thorny clumps of sea holly and gorse to pull herself forward whenever the gusts peaked into a deafening scream. The skin of her palms was raw, sliced by the sharp glass from the sunroom floor and punctured by the rocks, yet the physical pain was entirely insulated by the cold, paralyzing terror that drove her forward. Every few seconds, the world would explode into a blinding, electric white as the lightning walked across the surface of the churning sea. In these frantic windows of clarity, she kept her eyes locked on the tip of the cliff. Julian was still there. He had not shifted his position, but the earth beneath him was rapidly changing. The monstrous waves, driven by the full weight of the Atlantic tide, were throwing themselves against the base of the granite promontory with an apocalyptic fury, sending sheets of white foam exploding 50 feet into the air over his head. The very bedrock of the peninsula was vibrating under the impact, a deep, subaudible shudder that Elena could feel through the soles of her bleeding feet. The architecture he had trusted, the solid, unyielding stone of the coast, was being systematically dismantled by the element he had spent his life trying to lock out. She reached the perimeter of the cliffside path, where the vegetation gave way to bare, weather-beaten granite. The wind here was a monstrous thing, a physical wall that tried to hurl her backward toward the safety of the ravine. She could see Julian clearly now, only 20 paces away, silhouetted against the white, boiling cauldron of the sea below. His eyes were closed, his face turned upward into the freezing torrent, his arms still extended as if he were waiting to be lifted from the stone by the fingers of the gale. Elena did not call out his name, she knew the roaring vacuum of the storm would swallow her voice before it could travel a foot. Instead, she gathered the last remnants of her physical strength and lunged across the open rock. She dropped her weight low to the ground, crawling on her hands and knees over the slick granite, her fingers digging into the narrow fissures in the stone to anchor herself against the wind. She reached him just as a massive, jagged bolt of lightning struck the water directly off the point, a concussive blast of sound that tore the air apart and illuminated the absolute edge of the precipice. In that instant of blinding light, she saw a wide, dark fissure opening in the granite right beneath Julian's boots. The stone was fracturing, unbinding from the main cliffside under the relentless hammering of the waves. With a final, desperate surge, Elena threw herself forward across the splitting seam. Her hands went around Julian's waist, her fingers interlocking behind his back with a fierce, binding strength born of absolute refusal. She threw the entire weight of her body backward, pulling him away from the void with the desperate leverage of a drowning person pulling a companion onto a rock. The impact of her body tore Julian from his trance. His eyes flew open, locking onto the rain-drenched, blood-streaked face of his wife as they both tumbled backward onto the solid earth, just as the outer shelf of granite sheared away with a grinding roar, disappearing entirely into the white foam of the abyss below. They lay together in the mud and the driving rain, their bodies shaking with cold and exhaustion, their chests heaving in a synchronized, ragged rhythm. Julian did not push her away. Slowly, his hands came up from the wet stone, his long, rough fingers closing tightly around Elena's shoulders, pulling her face down into the hollow of his neck where the rain was warm against his skin. They were stripped of their secrets, their house was broken, and the foundation of their life was gone, but in the center of the howling dark, they were finally holding on to something real. Chapter 17, The Architecture of Ash. The fury of the Atlantic gale reached its screaming peak in the deep hours of the night and then, with the strange, sudden physics of coastal tempests, began to drain away into the sea. By the time the first gray ribbons of dawn cracked the eastern horizon, the rain had stopped entirely, leaving behind a cold, heavy mist that hung over the Brittany Peninsula like the smoke of an extinguished fire. The Atlantic had retreated from its assault, its high, white-crested walls sinking back into a low, rhythmic oily swell that slapped lazily against the freshly scarred base of the granite cliffs. The air was frigid, stripped of the oppressive midsummer heat that had choked the estate for weeks, smelling purely of raw salt, wet earth, and the metallic tang of lightning. Julian and Elena rose from the sodden earth of the promontory like survivors crawling from a battlefield. Neither looked down into the black abyss where the outer shelf of granite had disappeared into the surf. Their limbs were stiff from the cold, their skin caked with the dark, red clay of the cliffside path, and their linen garments were soaked through, clinging to their bodies like a second skin. Yet, as they began the slow, unsteady walk back toward the estate, Julian did not release his grip on Elena's hand. His fingers were locked around hers with a desperate, crushing intensity, an anchor that kept him tethered to the living world after his long, dangerous dance with the ghost of Clara. The estate grounds were unrecognizable in the cold light of dawn. The manicured gravel paths had been completely scoured away, replaced by deep, water-carved ravines that exposed the raw bedrock beneath. The stunted oaks along the driveway stood stripped of half their leaves, their broken branches littering the ground like skeletal remains. The grand house itself looked battered, its gray granite face streaked with long, dark veins of soot-colored rainwater, and the high chimneys whistling a low, mournful tune as the remaining drafts passed through the damp masonry. They entered through the heavy timber front doors, which hung loosely on their strained iron hinges. The grand hallway was dead, frozen in an absolute, tomb-like silence that contrasted sharply with the howling chaos they had just left behind on the cliffs. The floor flags were covered in a thin layer of muddy water and shredded leaves that had blown inward during the first breach of the gale. Elena's gaze immediately traveled to the foot of the stone staircase, expecting to see the pale, glacial blue of Vivian's morning gown waiting for them in the shadows. But the hallway was entirely empty. The double doors to the grand salon stood wide open, revealing a room that had been thoroughly ransacked by the wind. The heavy velvet drapes lay soaked and twisted on the floorboards, and the small lacquered box that had contained Julian's old letters had been overturned, its contents scattered across the damp Persian rug like a flock of dead white birds. Driven by a quiet, shared purpose that required no words, Julian and Elena ascended the stone staircase together, their wet footsteps leaving a dark, double trail on the restored timber steps. They walked past the ruined sunroom, where the shattered glass panel lay glittering like ice in the gray morning light, and moved directly toward the eastern wing where Vivian's private quarters lay. The door to Vivian's room was unlatched, swaying open an inch to reveal a space that was completely dark, the heavy linen curtains drawn tight against the dawn. Elena pushed the door open fully, her heart initiating that familiar, heavy thumping against her ribs. The room was pristine, entirely unaffected by the violence that had dismantled the rest of the house. The bed was made, its silk sheets smooth and undisturbed. But Vivian was not there. On the elegant writing desk in the center of the room sat a single, heavy silver candlestick, its flame extinguished, leaving a thin, curling ribbon of white smoke that rose toward the ceiling before dissolving into the cold air. Beside the candlestick lay a neat, folded square of heavy parchment paper, held down by Vivian's antique ivory fan. Elena stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the polished floorboards, and picked up the paper. She did not unfold it, she didn't need to read whatever parting venom her sister had written to understand the final calculation. The fan, left behind like a discarded signature, was entirely closed, its delicate ribs broken in two, a silent declaration that the game was finished, the strings had been cut, and the architect of shadows had vanished into the morning mist, leaving them to live within the ruins she had so meticulously designed. Elena turned back to Julian, who stood in the frame of the doorway, his dark eyes hollow but steady as he watched her. She did not show him the paper. Instead, she dropped it into the small stone hearth where the remnants of a peat fire lay cold, and with a single, deliberate movement of her bare foot, she crushed the broken ivory fan into the black ash. They stood together in the quiet room, the gray morning light slowly strengthening through the gaps in the curtains, illuminating the dirt on their skin and the raw reality of their survival. The beautiful lie of their summer vacation was over, the debt had been exposed, and the sister who had bound them together was gone. But as Julian reached out, his hand gently wiping a streak of red mud from Elena's cheek, the silence between them was no longer a cage, it was an empty canvas, a clearing in the wreckage where they could finally begin to build something that was entirely their own. Chapter 18, The Sifting of the Loom. The cold, gray morning mist that had blanketed the estate after the storm did not lift as the sun climbed higher into the sky, instead, it began to dissolve into a thick, luminous white fog that rolled in from the Atlantic, swallowing the cliffs, the driveway, and the charred remnants of the southern promontory. The world outside the granite walls became entirely featureless, a vast blank canvas of damp wool that muffled all sound and cast a uniform, shadowless glare through the tall windows. The estate felt more isolated than ever, detached from the peninsula and floating in an ocean of quiet, damp air that smelled of wet salt and crushed heather. Inside the house, the frantic energy of the rescue and the discovery of Vivian's departure gave way to a slow, methodical rhythm of labor. Julian did not retreat to his study, nor did he stare out at the missing shelf of stone on the cliffside. He remained by Elena's side. Together, they returned to the central hallway, carrying a heavy tin bucket of well water, coarse scrub brushes, and a stack of rough linen cloths. They began at the threshold, where the heavy timber doors still hung unevenly on their strained iron hinges. Without a single word passing between them, they dropped to their knees on the wet stone flags. Julian took the heavy wire brush, his long, muscular arms moving in deep, rhythmic arcs as he scoured away the red clay and ground and sea holly leaves that the gale had hammered into the masonry. Elena followed behind him, her hands wringing out the linen cloths in the cold water, wiping away the dirty foam until the pale gray granite beneath appeared clean, smooth, and honest for the first time all summer. The work was exhausting, a deliberate physical penance that strained their muscles and turned their fingers raw from the cold well water. Yet, as the hours wore on and the circle of clean stone expanded from the doorway toward the base of the staircase, the heavy, suffocating weight that had hung over their chests for months began to lift. Every stroke of the brush felt like an erasure of a past they had not chosen, every bucket of dirty water thrown out into the courtyard was a fragment of Vivian's beautifully orchestrated cage being purged from the house. By the time the midday light turned the fog outside into a brilliant, blinding white, they reached the top of the stairs and entered the ruined sunroom. The destruction here was still total. The shattered glass panel lay in a glittering, chaotic drift across the floorboards, and the driving rain from the night before had warped the old pine planks until they groaned underfoot. Elena walked to her loom, which stood in the center of the vortex like a skeletal ship that had survived a hurricane. The wind had thoroughly unraveled the tapestry she had spent the entire summer weaving, the indigo and slate wool threads were snapped, tangled, and matted with wet glass dust and salt water, the neat geometric patterns she had so carefully constructed entirely destroyed. Julian stepped up beside her, his boots crunching softly on the glass shards. He did not look at the ruin with his usual analytical, architectural gaze, trying to calculate how to repair the damage or restore it to its original state. Instead, he reached out, his large, rough hand closing over the wooden handle of a small iron shears that sat on the side table. He placed the tool gently into Elena's palm, his fingers lingering over hers for a long moment, a silent affirmation of absolute support. Elena looked from her husband's calm, hollowed face to the tangled wreckage on the loom. The tapestry had been her sanctuary, a place where she could hide from the silence of her marriage by burying herself in predictable, mechanical patterns. But those patterns had been a lie, woven under the shadow of Vivian's influence, using a palette that belonged to a house of secrets. With a steady hand, Elena slid the sharp iron blades beneath the main warp threads at the very top of the frame. She closed the shears with a clean, metallic snip. One by one, the tight, straining vertical lines that held the structure together began to pop and snap, releasing the matted weight of the wool. She worked her way down the frame, cutting away the ruined indigo waves, the jagged slate cliffs, and the entire record of her summer isolation. The matted textile slid from the wooden rollers, pooling at her feet in a heavy, formless mass of wet fiber and glass fragments, a dead thing that no longer had any hold over the room. When the last thread was cut, the loom stood entirely bare, its raw timber frame exposed to the bright, fog-filtered light of the afternoon. It was no longer a monument to her imprisonment, it was an empty skeleton, a clean structure waiting for a new design to be born. Julian stepped into the empty space behind the frame, his dark eyes meeting Elena's through the bare wooden bars of the loom. He reached his hand through the open space, his fingers uncurled and loose, and Elena met them with her own, their skin warm against the cold timber, their touch the only anchor they needed in the silent, empty house. Chapter 19, The Resurfaced Horizon. The blinding white fog that had cocooned the estate for a full day began to lose its dense, milky thickness as the afternoon waned, parting in long, lazy swaths to reveal a sky of an unblemished, pale sapphire. The sun, dropping lower toward the western horizon, cast a vast sheet of warm, golden honey over the entire Brittany peninsula. The Atlantic was completely calm now, its surface a pristine expanse of deep indigo that mirrored the clear sky above, its waves breaking against the base of the granite cliffs with a soft, rhythmic hiss that sounded like a gentle respiration. The air was cool, crisp, and clean, entirely purged of the rancid sweetness of the parched lavender fields, smelling only of wet salt and raw earth. Inside the estate, the physical labor of the past 24 hours had drawn to a close. The central hallway was pristine, the pale gray granite stone flags dried into a clean, uniform smoothness that caught the low, golden light from the open front doors. The dark trail of mud and shredded leaves had been entirely erased, and with it, the lingering, artificial scent of Vivian's expensive city perfume had been completely washed out of the masonry, leaving only the honest, ancient smell of the cedar wood and the sea. Julian and Elena emerged from the dark interior of the house together, stepping out onto the wet gravel of the courtyard. They had washed the red clay from their skin and changed their sodden garments for fresh, unadorned clothing of a simple cream linen that caught the warmth of the setting sun. They did not carry tools, notebooks, or bobbins, their hands were completely empty, save for the fact that Julian's fingers remained loosely, comfortably intertwined with Elena's as they walked. Their steps led them instinctively back toward the southern cliffs, along the very trail that had nearly become Julian's grave the night before. The path was scarred, showing deep fissures where the torrential rains had torn through the topsoil, but the air around them felt remarkably light. As they reached the edge of the promontory, they stopped a safe distance back from where the granite shelf had sheared away into the sea. From this vantage point, the lower cove was fully visible beneath the clear, golden light. The tide was far out, exposing the vast field of wet black boulders and green anemones that Elena had explored days ago. But the most dramatic change lay at the far end of the beach. The moss-covered stone cottage, which had for weeks anchored their anxiety like a dark sentinel, stood entirely empty. The small timber door was propped wide open, allowing the clean sea air to wash through the interior, and the small square windows caught the golden glare of the sun, flashing like signals of release. There was no blue smoke rising from the chimney, no tracks of heavy boots in the damp sand below, and no silhouette of a tall man holding a weathered leather notebook against the sky. Leon was gone. He had witnessed the breaking of the structure, he had seen the unvarnished truth dragged into the light, and like a ghost whose task was finally complete, he had vanished back into the vastness of the world, leaving his sister's relic behind in the ash of the hearth. Julian stood on the edge of the solid granite, his gaze fixed on the empty cottage for a long, silent minute. His chest rose and fell in a slow, peaceful rhythm that Elena had not felt since the very first day of their arrival. The frantic, scanning motion of his eyes was entirely gone, the hypervigilant sentinel had finally laid down his arms. He looked down at the dark, deep water where Clara had been lost 6 years before, his dark eyes clear and unburdened by the monstrous shadows that had haunted his blueprints. He was no longer trying to calculate a way to escape the sky or lock out the sea, he was simply standing on the bedrock of the living world, accepting the gravity of his survival. Elena turned her head to look at him, her heart filling with a quiet, profound warmth that had nothing to do with the desperate, frantic passion of the library floor. This was a new architecture, a slow, honest foundation being laid in the quiet afternoon light. She ran her thumb over the rough skin of his knuckles, a gentle, non-verbal assurance that she was there, that she was real, and that she was no longer a currency used to pay for his past. Julian turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers with a raw, piercing clarity that held no secrets, no debts, and no manipulation. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his free hand and reached out, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead, his palm resting against her cheek with a tenderness that felt like the very first true touch of their entire marriage. They stood together on the edge of the peninsula, their shadows stretching long and dark across the gold-rimmed rocks behind them, two survivors watching the sun sink beneath the horizon, ready to begin the slow, quiet architecture of a life that was entirely their own. Chapter 20, The Empty Frame. The final morning of their retreat broke over the Brittany Peninsula with a rare, crystalline purity that seemed to expose the raw geometry of the landscape. The sky was an unblemished slate of pale, early summer blue, and the Atlantic lay entirely flat, a silent expanse of cold sapphire that had ceased its violent pounding against the granite cliffs. The lingering humidity of the great midsummer crucible had been utterly washed away by the storm, leaving the air thin, sharp, and smelling intensely of sun-dried salt and wet pine needles. The lavender fields, battered but resilient, stood quiet under the morning sun, no longer emitting that thick, suffocating perfume that had trapped the house in an artificial dream for so many weeks. Inside the estate, the work of dismantling their presence had begun. The grand rooms, which had served as the stage for Vivian's psychological theater and Julian's hypervigilant mania, were systematically stripped of their temporary domesticity. Julian and Elena moved through the high, arched spaces like curators packing away an exhibition that had concluded its run. There was no haste in their movements, nor was there the heavy, suffocating avoidance that had defined the early weeks of their stay. They operated with a calm, synchronized fluidity, their tasks overlapping naturally without the need for a single spoken cue to coordinate their labor. In the eastern wing, Julian cleared his drafting table for the last time. He did not roll up his technical drawings with that frantic, protective urgency that had characterized his behavior before the storm. He gathered the curling blueprints of the historic estate, his fingers smoothing down the edges where the salt moisture had warped the heavy paper. Beside them lay his steel rulers, his brass compasses, and his fine-tipped technical ink pens, the sterile, precise tools he had used as armor to lock out the variable of his grief. He packed them into his wooden toolbox, the very box that had shattered across the flagstones days before, its brass hinges now wiped clean of red clay. He did not look back at the dark, empty bookcases or the stone walls that had held the shadow of Vivian's leverage. He lifted the box, its weight familiar and solid, and carried it down the stone staircase, his dark eyes clear, steady, and fixed entirely on the open front doors where the morning light streamed inward. Elena spent the early hours of the morning in the sunroom, performing the final sifting of her workspace. The floorboards had been thoroughly swept of a glittering carpet of broken glass, and the shattered panel had been boarded up with clean, unpainted pine planks that let in the scent of the sea air without the howling drafts of the gale. Her loom stood completely bare in the center of the room, its raw timber frame casting a clean, skeletal shadow across the floor. She did not reach for the bobbins of indigo or slate wool that remained in the storage bins. Instead, she gathered her personal belongings, her sketchbooks of natural plant dyes, her small silver rings, and the few simple linen dresses she had worn during her long hours of isolation. She placed them into a single, weathered canvas portmanteau. Before she left the room, her gaze dropped to the hollow beam beneath the loom where she had once hidden the silver fountain pen with Julian's initials. The hiding place was empty now, the pen having been surrendered to the ash of the hearth along with Vivian's broken ivory fan. The secrecy that had necessitated that cache had been dissolved by the torrent, leaving the bare wood of the sunroom honest and exposed. They met at the foot of the stairs, each carrying a single piece of luggage. Together, they walked through the house, closing the heavy interior doors one by one, sealing the grand salon, the library, and the dining room back into their historic, uninhabited silence. The scattered letters, the yellowed newspaper clipping, and the financial ledgers had vanished from the Persian rugs, leaving the room stripped of their modern tragedy and restored to the quiet custody of time. The estate was no longer a cage or a fortress, it was simply an old stone house built on a granite cliff, indifferent to the ghosts that had tried to claim its foundations. Julian loaded their luggage into the back of the small open-top vehicle parked in the courtyard, his movements deliberate and unhurried. When the final latches were secured, he did not immediately climb into the driver's seat. He turned back toward the house, his hand extending across the dark metal frame toward Elena. Elena met his gaze, her heart filling with a calm, unyielding certainty that had been forged in the mud of the promontory. She reached out, her fingers interlocking with his, her palm pressing against his skin with a familiar, grounding warmth. They stood together in the center of the granite courtyard, looking back at the massive front doors of the estate for a final, silent minute. The house loomed large against the pale blue sky, its gray granite face catching the full glare of the morning sun. It looked old, beautiful, and completely empty. There was no blue silk gown fluttering in the windows of the salon, no tall watcher observing them from the cliffs below, and no shadow of a past love lingering in the corners of the masonry. The frame of their summer vacation was completely empty, the debt had been cancelled, and the architecture of their old life had been thoroughly dismantled. Julian turned away from the house first, his dark eyes reflecting the vast, open horizon of the Atlantic. He climbed into the vehicle, and Elena stepped in beside him, her linen skirt pooling comfortably around her legs. As the engine flared to life, breaking the long silence of the peninsula with a steady, forward-looking rumble, they pulled away from the courtyard, the vehicle tracking slowly down the gravel driveway toward the main road that led away from the coast. They did not look back at the chimneys or the cliffs as the estate dissolved into the distance behind them, their eyes fixed entirely on the road ahead, ready to begin the slow, quiet construction of a journey that belonged to them alone. Chapter 21, The Unmapped Crossing. The coastal road cutting across the northern shoulder of the Brittany Peninsula rose and fell in a series of steep, sweeping curves that eventually left the granite estate and its jagged cliffs far behind. As the small vehicle traveled further inland, the salt-saturated maritime atmosphere began to shift, losing its heavy, dramatic bite and softening into the deep, earthy breath of the French countryside. The sky remained an immaculate, high-arched canopy of pale sapphire, but the view of the open Atlantic was gradually replaced by rolling hillsides of dense, vibrant green, partitioned by ancient stone fences that were overgrown with wild white roses and thick brambles of blackberry. For hours, the only sound accompanying their journey was the steady, mechanical pulse of the engine and the rush of the wind against the canvas frame of the car. Julian sat behind the wheel, his long fingers wrapped loosely but securely around the leather rim, his eyes fixed on the ribbon of dusty gray asphalt that unfolded before them. The tight, defensive knot that had kept his jaw locked for the duration of their summer retreat had finally unraveled. His dark eyes no longer scanned the horizon for variables or shadows, they tracked the natural contours of the road ahead with a calm, unhurried precision. He was a man relearning the mechanics of forward motion, moving through a space that had not been measured, mapped, or paid for by someone else's calculations. Elena leaned her head back against the leather headrest, letting her eyes drift across the shifting landscape. The canvas portmanteau resting at her feet contained everything she owned from the peninsula, but the invisible weight that had pressed down on her chest since their arrival in June had been left in the ash of the estate's hearth. She looked down at her hands, which lay relaxed in her lap. The skin was still marked by faint, healing lines from the shattered glass of the sunroom, but the phantom tension of the loom, the compulsive need to pull and knot the threads into a structure of defense, was completely gone. She was no longer trying to weave an alternative reality to shield herself from the silence of her marriage. The silence now was different, it was open, clean, and entirely devoid of threat. By late afternoon, the sun began its slow, majestic descent toward the west, casting long, gold-rimmed shadows across the undulating fields of wheat and rye. The vehicle crossed a narrow, humpbacked stone bridge that spanned a shallow, clear-running river, where the water rippled over smooth gray pebbles and long ribbons of green river weed. On the far side of the crossing sat a tiny, unhurried hamlet, a cluster of ancient, timber-framed cottages with steep slate roofs that were nestled into the valley like sleeping animals. Julian slowed the vehicle, pulling onto a narrow patch of gravel beside a small, centuries-old stone church whose bell tower was silhouetted against the warm, golden glare of the evening sky. He cut the engine, and the sudden cessation of the mechanical hum allowed the natural symphony of the countryside to flood the cabin, the distant, rhythmic lowing of cattle in the pastures, the soft rustle of the poplars lining the riverbank, and the cheerful, erratic nesting calls of swallows high in the masonry of the tower. Neither of them moved to climb out immediately. They remained seated in the quiet vehicle, the heat of the engine ticking softly as it cooled in the evening air. Julian turned his head slowly, his dark eyes meeting Elena's with an absolute, unvarnished clarity that required no defense, no explanation, and no borrowed history. Slowly, deliberately, he released his grip on the steering wheel and extended his right hand across the narrow space between the seats, his palm open and facing upward in the golden light. Elena did not hesitate. She reached out, her fingers sliding into his, her palms settling against his with a deep, grounding warmth that felt entirely new. This was not the frantic, bruising collision of the library floor, nor was it the desperate, terrified grip of the crumbling cliffside. It was a simple, quiet intersection of two people who had survived the dismantling of their illusions and were now willing to exist in the empty space left behind. They climbed out of the car together, their hands still joined, and walked slowly toward the edge of the riverbank where the grass grew tall and sweet-scented. The water caught the full, bleeding orange of the sunset, transforming the river into a moving vein of liquid gold that flowed steadily toward a horizon they had not yet mapped. They stood together in the cooling twilight, their simple linen garments catching the last warmth of the sun, two entities standing on the bank of an unmapped crossing, ready to begin the slow, quiet architecture of a life that was finally, genuinely theirs. Chapter 22, The Solid Ground. The deep, bleeding orange of the rural twilight slowly dissolved into a profound, velvety violet that settled over the valley like a cooling hand. High above the ancient stone bell tower of the hamlet, the first stars began to blink into existence, tiny, silver pinpricks cutting through the high-altitude haze of the warm midsummer night. The air around the riverbank grew thick with the scent of damp moss, sweet clover, and the cool, clean moisture of the running water, completely detached from the harsh, brine-soaked atmosphere that had defined their lives on the northern coast. Julian and Elena did not return to the small vehicle as the darkness deepened. Instead, they walked along the narrow dirt path that followed the gentle curve of the river, their fingers still lightly, comfortably intertwined. The ground beneath their bare feet was soft, composed of rich, fertile alluvial soil and patches of thick, springy moss that had dried under the afternoon sun. It was a stark contrast to the unforgiving granite flags of the estate or the treacherous, crumbling clay of the cliffs. Here, the earth felt remarkably solid, a reliable foundation that did not vibrate with the violent fury of an angry ocean or threaten to shear away into an abyss. They stopped near an old, weather-beaten wooden bench that sat beneath the sweeping branches of a massive willow tree. The long, delicate leaves of the willow hung down to the water's surface, creating a private, shaded sanctuary that caught the soft, silver reflection of the stars on the rippling river. Julian sat down first, his movements fluid and unburdened by the physical exhaustion or the manic tension that had dictated his carriage for the past 2 months. He leaned his back against the rough timber, his dark eyes fixed not on a technical drawing or a horizon he needed to defend, but on the quiet, steady flow of the water. Elena sat beside him, her cream linen skirt rustling softly in the cool night breeze. She did not pull her canvas portmanteau with her, she had left it in the back of the car, a physical marker of a past that no longer required her constant vigilance. She looked down at the river, watching a loose willow leaf catch the current and float smoothly downstream, turning lazily in the silver light until it vanished around the bend. For the first time since their marriage had been compromised by Vivian's calculations, Elena felt a sense of profound, internal stillness, a realization that the current of time was moving them forward, away from the wreckage, and that she did not need to fight the flow to survive. Without a single word breaking the deep, natural silence of the valley, Julian shifted his position. He reached out, his large, rough hand sliding behind Elena's waist, and pulled her gently against his side. Elena yielded to the movement completely, leaning her shoulder into his chest, her head finding a natural resting place in the hollow of his neck. The scent of his skin had changed, the sharp, metallic tang of the coastal storm and the bitter lavender ink had been washed away, replaced by the clean, simple warmth of the countryside sun. He lifted his other hand and began to run his fingers through her hair, his touch slow, rhythmic, and entirely devoid of the frantic, bruising hunger that had characterized their desperate encounter in the shaded library. That passion had been a shield built out of terror, an attempt to hide from a ghost that was already inside the house. This touch was different. It was an acknowledgement of reality, a quiet, nonverbal declaration that they were alive, that they were together, and that the space between them was no longer an echo chamber for hidden debts and old tragedies. They remained on the old wooden bench for hours, watching the silver moon rise high over the slate roofs of the hamlet, its light transforming the valley into a peaceful, monochrome landscape of shadow and silver. The silence between them was no longer a cage constructed by a manipulative sister or a fortress maintained by a guilt-ridden architect. It had become a shared sanctuary, a clean, unwritten space where their heartbeats could finally synchronize without the interference of the past. They did not know where the road would take them when the morning sun returned to light the valley, nor did they care to calculate the load-bearing capacity of their future. They were simply two survivors resting on solid ground, holding on to one another in the quiet aftermath of a beautiful, devastating truth, ready to build a life that belonged to them alone. Chapter 23, The Unwritten Meridian. The silver moonlight that had bathed the inland valley slowly gave way to the soft, lavender-toned translucent air of the final midsummer dawn. A low-slung, delicate mist hung just inches above the surface of the river, curling around the hanging fronds of the old willow tree like pale threads left behind by a phantom loon. As the sun crept over the distant, pine-crested hills, it did not burst into the aggressive, baking furnace of the coast. Instead, it spread a wide, gentle wash of pale primrose and rose gold across the sky, illuminating the ancient slate roofs of the sleeping hamlet with a quiet, regenerative warmth. Julian and Elena did not stay on the wooden bench to watch the mist entirely dissolve. They rose with the first true light of day, their bodies no longer stiff with the defensive freeze of the peninsula, but moving with a loose, unhurried vitality. Their linen garments, though wrinkled from the long hours of travel and the overnight vigil by the water, felt light against their skin. The red clay that had caked their shoes was gone, left behind in the tall grass of the riverbank, leaving only the clean morning dew to wash over their feet. They walked back to the small open-top vehicle together, their fingers remaining loosely, comfortably woven together. The canvas portmanteau and the wooden box of drafting tools sat undisturbed in the back, no longer functioning as monuments to their respective isolations, but simply as baggage for a journey that was finally their own. Julian did not initiate his hypervigilant perimeter check around the vehicle, nor did he scan the rising mist for signs of an intruder. He walked straight to the driver's side, his posture relaxed, his shoulders holding none of the rigid, load-bearing tension that had defined his silhouette for 6 years. Elena climbed into the passenger seat, her eyes tracking the quiet, steady movements of her husband. She watched him place his hands on the steering wheel, not with the tight, white-knuckled grip of a man fleeing a collapsing structure, but with the calm, assured hold of a traveler who knew the road beneath him was solid. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the empty space where she had spent weeks carrying the weight of Vivian's secrets and Leon's notebook. There was nothing left to hide, nothing left to bury, and nothing left to negotiate. The slate had been wiped completely clean by the Atlantic gale, leaving them in a profound, liberating vacancy. The engine flared to life with a low, reliable rumble that broke the morning silence of the hamlet, but the sound carried no threat. It was a forward-looking pulse, a heartbeat for the empty road that stretched out before them. Julian shifted the vehicle into gear, and they began to move, tracking away from the river crossing and ascending the winding valley road that led toward the interior of the country, entirely away from the northern coast. As the vehicle climbed the crest of the hill, the entire valley unfolded beneath them in the full, glorious glare of the morning sun. The fields of wheat and rye shimmered like sheets of gold in the early light, and the river looked like a bright, silver ribbon cutting a path through the ancient landscape. Elena looked back one final time, not out of longing or regret, but to witness the absolute erasure of the horizon they had left behind. There was no granite estate visible against the sky, no fractured promontory crumbling into a white abyss, and no emerald or blue silk shadows lingering in the corners of her memory. The prison had vanished into the geography of the past. Julian reached across the narrow space between the seats, his large hand turning upward to receive hers. Elena met his palm with her own, their skin warm, dry, and grounded in the present moment. They did not need to speak to fill the silence, they did not need to construct a blueprint or weave a pattern to justify the space they occupied together. The silence was no longer a symptom of their brokenness, it had become their sanctuary, a vast, unmapped meridian where their lives could finally unfold without the architecture of a lie to support them. They drove forward into the expanding brightness of the day, their eyes fixed entirely on the unwritten horizon ahead, two survivors completely free, whole, and finally tracing a path that belonged to them alone.